For 23 years, I kept a promise that never made sense. My husband asked me never to sell our old fishing boat. Not after he was gone. Not if money became tight. Not even if I never planned to sail again. He looked me straight in the eyes from his hospital bed and made me promise. I laughed and told him no one would ever want that rusty old thing anyway. He didn't laugh back. He simply squeezed my hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll never let anyone have that boat." I promised. After he passed away, life became much harder than either of us imagined. The bills kept arriving. The house needed repairs. My pension barely covered groceries. Friends told me to sell the boat. Neighbors said it had been rotting at the dock for years. Even my own son insisted it was nothing more than floating scrap metal. Every single time, I refused, not because I understood why, but because it was the last promise I ever made to the man I loved. Then, one cold autumn morning, a storm broke one of the dock lines. The old boat drifted toward the rocks. I rushed there before sunrise, terrified I'd lose it forever. As I stepped inside the cabin for the first time since my husband's funeral, I noticed something that had never been there before. Or perhaps, something I had never truly seen. That single discovery would change everything I believed about my husband, about our marriage, and about the secret he had protected for more than 30 years. The first time my husband showed me that boat, I thought he had lost his mind. It was not beautiful, not in the way people imagine boats are supposed to be beautiful. It was old, heavy, scratched by years of salt and wind, with faded blue paint peeling from the sides and a small wooden cabin that smelled of diesel, damp rope, and something I could never quite name. The windows were cloudy. The railing leaned slightly to one side. The deck creaked even when the water was calm. But Harold stood beside it like he was showing me a castle. He placed one hand on the side of the boat and smiled in that quiet way of his, the way he smiled when something mattered too much for jokes. "What do you think?" he asked. I looked at the boat, then at him, then back at the boat. "I think," I said, "that if this thing sinks, I am not swimming after you." He laughed so hard that day the dock shook under his boots. That was Harold. He could laugh with his whole body, but he could also go silent in a way that made a room feel smaller. He was not a man who explained himself easily. He showed love by fixing what was broken, by leaving coffee ready before sunrise, by putting his coat over my shoulders before I knew I was cold. We had been married 11 years when he bought the boat. We were not rich. We were not even comfortable most months. There was always something to pay, something to repair, something waiting to take the little money we had saved. So when he came home one evening and told me he had bought an old fishing boat, I thought he was teasing me. Then he drove me to the marina. And there it was. The boat was named Grace, painted in crooked white letters near the stern. I asked him who Grace was. He looked at the name for a long moment before answering. "Just a name," he said. I should have noticed the pause. But back then, I was younger, busier, and still foolish enough to believe love meant knowing everything about the person sleeping beside you. Harold used that boat often in the beginning. Not for long trips, not for anything fancy. He would go out early, before the sun lifted fully over the water, and return by noon with 2 fish, sometimes none, always smelling like cold air and engine oil. He said the water helped him think. I believed him. For years, that boat became part of our life without ever truly becoming part of mine. It was Harold's place. His quiet place. His little floating world. I went with him a few times, mostly during warmer months, but I never loved the water the way he did. I loved watching him love it. There is a difference. Then, as the years passed, he started going less. His back hurt. His hands stiffened. The engine became unreliable. The boat stayed tied at the old dock more often than it moved. Still, he kept paying the small docking fee. Still, he checked on it after storms. Still, whenever someone joked that he should sell it, his face changed. Not angry. Worse. Afraid. I saw that look only a few times in our marriage. Once when our son had a fever that would not break. Once when Harold got a phone call in the middle of the night and refused to tell me who it was. And once when a man at the marina offered him cash for the boat. The man said he restored old vessels. He said Grace had good bones. He said Harold was letting her waste away. Harold listened politely until the man touched the cabin door. Then my husband stepped forward so quickly I barely recognized him. "She is not for sale," he said. The man lifted both hands and laughed awkwardly. "I didn't mean anything by it." Harold did not laugh. On the drive home, I asked him why he had reacted that way. He kept both hands on the wheel. "I don't like strangers touching what's mine," he said. That was all. I let it go. That is one of the things old age teaches you too late. Most secrets do not survive because someone is clever. They survive because the people around them are tired, trusting, or afraid to ask one more question. I was all three. By the time Harold got sick, the boat had not left the dock in almost 4 years. Cancer did not arrive like thunder. It came quietly, disguised as weight loss, exhaustion, small pains he brushed away. By the time he stopped pretending it was nothing, there was very little time left for either of us to pretend anything. Those final weeks changed the shape of our house. The bedroom became a place of pill bottles, folded blankets, whispered phone calls, and sunlight that always seemed too bright. Friends came with casseroles. Our son came when he could. The pastor came twice. Harold thanked everyone, smiled for everyone, comforted everyone. But at night, when the house was still, he would grip my hand and stare at the ceiling as if he were listening to something far away. One evening, rain tapped against the windows. I was sitting beside him, rubbing lotion into his hands because the medicine had made his skin dry. He had barely spoken all day. Then he said my name, not the quick way people call you from another room, the heavy way, "Martha." I looked up. His eyes were clearer than they had been in days. "I need you to promise me something." I smiled because I thought he meant the usual things. "Take care of yourself. Don't let the house fall apart. Forgive our son for being impatient." Things dying people say because they are trying to keep loving after they leave. "What is it?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "The boat." I stopped rubbing his hands. "What about it?" "Don't sell it." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so strange. We were facing hospital bills, funeral costs, a roof that needed replacing, and he was worried about that old boat. "Harold," I said softly, "nobody is thinking about the boat right now." "I am." His voice was weak, but the words were firm. I leaned closer. "Why?" He closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he had fallen asleep. Then he whispered, "Promise me you won't sell it. Not to anyone. Not for any reason." I felt something cold move through me. "Harold, what is in that boat?" His fingers tightened around mine. "Promise first." I should have refused. I should have made him tell me. But when the person you love is lying in front of you with time running out, promises become easier than questions. So I promised. He opened his eyes again, and tears gathered there. Harold was not a man who cried easily. I had seen him cry only once before, at his mother's funeral. "Thank you," he said. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 3 days later, he was gone. And I became the keeper of a promise I did not understand. The funeral took place on a gray Thursday morning, under a sky that seemed unable to decide whether it wanted to rain or simply stay heavy forever. People often tell you that the hardest part is saying goodbye. They mean well, but they are wrong. The hardest part begins the morning after everyone leaves. When the flowers start to wilt. When the casseroles stop arriving. When the phone no longer rings every hour. When the empty chair across the breakfast table suddenly becomes louder than any conversation. That first Friday, I woke before sunrise out of habit. For 40 years, Harold had been the first one awake. I would hear the old coffee maker sputtering in the kitchen, then the back door opening as he stepped outside to check the weather. Every single morning, that day, there was only silence. I still walked into the kitchen. I still reached for 2 coffee mugs. Only when I poured the second cup did I realize what I had done. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the steam rising from a cup no one would ever drink. Grief is strange. It doesn't arrive all at once. It hides inside ordinary moments. A second coffee cup. A jacket hanging behind the door. A pair of muddy boots that nobody remembers to move. His reading glasses still resting on the newspaper he never finished. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. Our son, Daniel, came every Saturday. He worried about me, though he tried not to show it. He fixed loose cabinet doors, mowed the lawn, carried groceries inside without asking. One afternoon, he opened the garage and looked around before turning to me. "Mom, you know Dad wouldn't want you living like this." "I know. You should start letting some things go." "I will." He nodded toward the fishing gear stacked neatly against the wall. "The boat should probably be first." I froze. He noticed immediately. "What?" "Your father asked me not to sell it." Daniel frowned. "The boat?" I nodded. "He made me promise." My son looked confused. "Seriously?" "Yes." He sat quietly for a moment. "Did he tell you why?" "No." Daniel sighed. Dad always had his mysteries. I forced a smile. He certainly did. But after Daniel left, those words refused to leave my mind. Mysteries. Had Harold really been mysterious? Or had I simply stopped asking questions after so many years together? Marriage has a way of creating comfortable assumptions. You stop wondering why someone always takes the same road home, why they disappear every Tuesday morning, why they keep one door locked. You tell yourself you already know them, maybe better than they know themselves. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous that belief can be. About a month after the funeral, I drove to the marina for the first time alone. The owner, Frank, had known Harold for over 30 years. He spotted my truck before I even stepped out. "I'm sorry, Martha." "Thank you." He removed his cap and looked toward the dock where Grace rested exactly where Harold had left her. "I've been keeping an eye on her. I appreciate that." We walked together without speaking. The marina sounded exactly as it always had. Ropes tapping against masts, seagulls arguing overhead, water gently knocking against wooden pilings. Life continuing without permission. When we reached the boat, I stopped. She looked older somehow, not because of rust, because Harold wasn't standing beside her anymore. Frank broke the silence. He loved this boat. "I know. He came here even when he stopped taking her out." I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "He'd just sit inside the cabin sometimes." "For how long?" "Oh, an hour. Sometimes 2. "And he wasn't fishing?" Frank shook his head. "No." "What did he do?" I never asked. That answer unsettled me more than I expected. Harold had been spending hours inside that tiny cabin without leaving the dock. Doing what? Reading? Thinking? Remembering? Frank looked at me carefully. "You never came with him much, did you?" "No." He always came alone. Something about the way he said those words stayed with me. Alone. At least, that's what everyone believed. Before leaving, I stepped onto the boat for only a few seconds. The deck groaned beneath my feet exactly as it always had. The steering wheel was covered with dust. The old compass still hung above the dashboard. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing looked hidden. Nothing looked important enough to explain a dying man's final request. I climbed back onto the dock. "I should probably sell her," I whispered almost to myself. Frank looked surprised. "I thought Harold asked you not to." "He did." "Then don't." His answer came so quickly that I blinked. "You don't even know why." "No." "Then why say that?" He smiled sadly. "Because I knew Harold." I waited. If he asked for a promise, he had a reason. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence. He had a reason. Maybe. Or maybe grief had turned all of us into storytellers, searching desperately for meaning where none existed. Over the next several months, money became tighter than I ever imagined. The roof finally started leaking. The furnace failed during the coldest week of winter. Medical bills continued arriving long after Harold was buried. I sold old furniture. I canceled subscriptions. I even took sewing jobs from neighbors to earn a little extra income. Still, I never touched the boat. Then came the first offer. A retired fisherman knocked on my door carrying photographs of restored boats. He offered $12,000. More money than I had seen in one place since Harold's illness began. I almost accepted. My hand actually reached for the paperwork. Then I remembered Harold's eyes. Not frightened. Not desperate.
Certain.
I folded the papers and handed them back. I'm sorry. The man looked disappointed. May I ask why? My husband made me promise. He smiled politely, the way people smile when they think grief has made someone unreasonable. He's gone now. I nodded. Yes. So, the promise doesn't really matter anymore. I looked directly at him. It's the only thing he left me to protect. The man didn't argue again. After he drove away, I stood on the porch for a long time. Part of me wondered if I had made the biggest financial mistake of my life. The other part, the part that still reached across the bed some nights expecting to find Harold beside me, knew I could never break my word. Not while I still remembered the sound of his voice asking for that promise. I had no idea then that keeping the boat would eventually cost me far more than money, but it would also lead me to a truth I never imagined existed. The years passed more quietly than I ever expected. People imagine grief as something that slowly disappears. It doesn't. It simply changes its clothes. At first, it is loud. It cries with you. It keeps you awake. It follows you into every room. Years later, it becomes quieter. It waits inside photographs. It hides inside old songs on the radio. It appears every time someone says your husband's name in the past tense. I learned to live with that version of grief. The boat became part of that routine. Every few weeks, I drove to the marina with a bucket, a rag, and a small toolbox Harold had always kept in the garage. I never took Grace out onto the water. I wouldn't have known how. Instead, I cleaned the deck, checked the ropes, aired out the cabin, and made sure the rainwater hadn't found its way inside. The other boat owners started recognizing me. Some waved.
Some stopped to talk.
Others simply smiled as they walked past. To them, I was the widow who couldn't let go. I didn't blame them. Sometimes I wondered if they were right. One spring morning, nearly 8 years after Harold died, I met a man named Walter while I was scrubbing the railing. He was restoring an old sailboat a few slips away. Unlike most people, he didn't ask why I still owned Grace. Instead, he admired the craftsmanship. They don't build cabins like this anymore, he said, running his hand along the weathered wood. It belonged to my husband. I figured. He loved this boat. Walter nodded thoughtfully. I can tell. You can? He smiled. Boats remember their owners. I laughed. That's a strange thing to say. So, is believing what has no memory. There was something comforting about him. He never pushed. Never asked questions that weren't his to ask. Over the next few years, we spoke often whenever our visits happened to overlap. Mostly about weather, engines, fishing. Sometimes about Harold. Walter had never met him, yet he listened as though he had. One afternoon, he asked something that caught me completely off guard. Have you ever replaced the flooring inside the cabin? No. You might want to check underneath someday. I frowned. Why? He shrugged. Old fishermen were practical men. What does that mean? They hid things. I laughed again. You've been watching too many detective movies. Maybe. He smiled and returned to sanding his sailboat. I forgot about the conversation almost immediately. At least, I thought I had. Months later, while dusting the shelves inside our house, I found one of Harold's old journals. It wasn't really a diary. Harold wasn't the kind of man who wrote about feelings. It contained measurements, fishing locations, weather notes, engine repairs, lists of supplies, receipts folded neatly between pages. Nothing unusual, until one page near the middle. There was no date. Only one sentence written in Harold's careful handwriting. Some promises protect people. Others protect the truth. That was it. No explanation. No names. No context. I stared at those words for nearly an hour. Protect the truth. What truth? For the first time since his death, I considered breaking the promise. Not by selling the boat. By searching it. Immediately afterward, guilt washed over me. Harold had trusted me. Would searching the boat be the same as betraying him? Or would it be honoring him by finally understanding? I couldn't answer that question. So I placed the journal back inside the drawer and closed it. Life continued. Until another offer arrived. This one wasn't from a fisherman. It came from a real estate developer. The marina had been sold. Luxury condominiums were planned along the waterfront. Boat owners were receiving generous offers to clear their slips before construction began. The amount they offered me was more money than Harold and I had ever saved together. Enough to replace my roof. Enough to renovate the house. Enough to stop worrying every month. Daniel was thrilled. Mom, this is different. I know. This isn't just selling the boat. I know. They're practically begging people to leave. I know. He looked at me carefully. So, why are you hesitating? Because your father looked terrified. The words stayed inside my head. Instead, I simply answered, I made a promise. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Dad has been gone almost 10 years. I know. You don't even know why, he asked. I know. He sighed deeply. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Harold had been weak. He had been dying. But he had not been confused. Not once. His memory remained sharp until the very end. No, I said quietly. He knew exactly what he was saying. Daniel didn't argue, but I could see disappointment in his eyes. After he left, I sat alone in the living room watching the rain fall against the windows. The developer's offer rested on the coffee table.
And signed.
Beside it lay Harold's old journal. Without thinking, I opened it again. This time something slipped from between 2 pages. A folded receipt.
Old.
Yellowed. The ink had nearly disappeared. It was from a marine supply store. Dated almost 26 years earlier. One item caught my attention. Custom brass hinges. Cabin floor modification. I read the line again. Cabin floor modification. I frowned. I had cleaned that cabin for years. I had never noticed anything unusual about the floor. Never. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear. Recognition. Like hearing a melody you haven't heard since childhood. Something buried deep inside my memory began trying to surface. Walter's voice echoed in my mind. Old fishermen hid things. Then Harold's words followed. Some promises protect the truth. For the first time in nearly a decade, the boat no longer felt like an old memory tied to a dock. It felt like a question. And somewhere beneath that weathered cabin floor, I was beginning to believe the answer had been waiting for me all along. I did not sleep that night. The receipt stayed on my bedside table, folded exactly as I had found it, yet it felt as though it had grown heavier with every passing hour. Every time I closed my eyes, the same words returned. Cabin floor modification. It sounded so ordinary, almost disappointingly ordinary. But Harold was never the kind of man who spent money without a reason. During our entire marriage, he repaired almost everything himself. He rebuilt fences with reclaimed wood. He fixed appliances using spare parts from junkyards. He sharpened old tools instead of buying new ones. If he had paid someone to modify the floor of that cabin, there had to be a reason. Just before dawn, I gave up trying to sleep. I brewed coffee, wrapped myself in Harold's old flannel jacket, and sat on the porch watching the first light spread across the trees. The neighborhood was silent. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since Harold died. Curiosity. Not grief. Not loneliness.
Curiosity.
It frightened me more than either of the others. Because curiosity has a way of pulling people toward truths they may not be ready to carry. Around 9 that morning, I drove to the marina. Grace rested exactly where she always had, gently rising and falling with the tide as though nothing in the world had changed. But something had changed.
Me.
I stepped aboard carrying only a flashlight, a screwdriver, and Harold's journal. I wasn't planning to tear the boat apart. I only wanted to look. The cabin smelled exactly as it always had. Old pine.
Salt.
Engine oil. A trace of mildew that never completely disappeared, no matter how many times I cleaned. Sunlight entered through the dusty windows, creating long golden lines across the worn wooden floor. I knelt slowly. For years I had scrubbed those boards without truly seeing them. Now I studied every inch. The wood was old, weathered, marked by thousands of footsteps. Then I noticed it. Near the back wall, one row of screws looked slightly newer than the others. Not new, just less old. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself there were dozens of harmless explanations. Maybe Harold had repaired water damage. Maybe one board had cracked years earlier. Maybe I was imagining things because I wanted the mystery to exist. I reached down and ran my fingers across the screw heads. Someone had removed them before. More than once. The grooves showed tiny scratches left by a screwdriver. I sat back against the wall. My hands were trembling. "Harold," I whispered. "What were you protecting?" For nearly 20 minutes, I simply sat there. I could remove those screws. It would take less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes. To break a promise that had lasted almost 10 years. I stood up, walked outside, locked the cabin, then climbed back onto the dock. "No," I said aloud. "I promised." I started walking toward my truck. Halfway there, Frank called my name. "Martha." I turned. He was carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. "Everything all right?" "I think so." "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Just thinking." Frank leaned against a piling. "You know, Harold used to do that too." "Do what?" "Sit inside that cabin for long stretches." I nodded. "You mentioned that." He hesitated. "There was something else." I looked at him. "What?" "I never thought it mattered." My stomach tightened. "What didn't matter?" He scratched his chin. "About once a year, usually in October, another man would meet him here." I stared at him. "Another man?" Frank nodded. They'd stay inside the cabin together for maybe half an hour. I could barely speak. "Who was he?" "I don't know." "You never ask?" Frank shrugged apologetically. "People have private lives." "What did he look like?" "Tall." "Older?" "About Harold's age." "Did they fish together?"
No.
"They never even untied the boat." A cold sensation spread through my chest. "They just sat inside?" Frank nodded. "Then the other man would leave." "When was the last time?" Frank thought for a moment. "The year before Harold got sick." My mind raced. In 40 years of marriage, Harold had met another man every October, inside a boat, without ever mentioning him. I wanted to believe Frank had remembered incorrectly. I wanted to believe he was confusing Harold with someone else. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. I thanked him and drove home in complete silence. That evening I spread every photograph we owned across the dining room table. Vacation pictures, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, fishing trips, family reunions, anything that might contain a clue. For hours I searched every face, every background, every stranger standing just far enough away to escape notice. Then, in an old photograph taken nearly 25 years earlier, I found him. Harold stood beside Grace, smiling after catching an enormous striped bass. Several yards behind him, almost hidden near another dock, a tall man wearing a dark cap watched the boat. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't fishing. He was simply watching. At first I assumed he was just another person at the marina. Then I turned the photograph over. Harold had written the date, October 14th, the same month Frank had mentioned. I looked back at the man's face. It was too blurry to recognize. But something about his posture unsettled me. He didn't look like a stranger. He looked like someone waiting. Waiting for Harold. Waiting for something. I suddenly remembered another detail. Every October, Harold always insisted on visiting the marina alone. No matter the weather. No matter how busy life became. He always went. I had never questioned it. Why would I? Married people don't keep calendars of each other's habits. Not the harmless ones. At least, they seem harmless until one small receipt, one forgotten conversation, and one old photograph begin fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. That night, for the first time since Harold died, I unlocked the drawer where I kept all of his personal papers. If the answers existed anywhere, I was beginning to believe they had been quietly waiting for me all along. The drawer had not been opened in years. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, because I was afraid of what wasn't. For nearly a decade, everything Harold had left behind remained exactly where he had placed it. His wallet, his military discharge papers, Old tax returns. The owner's manual for a truck we had sold 15 years earlier. Receipts folded with impossible precision. Birthday cards from our son. A faded photograph of his parents standing beside a farmhouse that no longer existed. Harold never threw paper away. He believed every document told a story. You never know what you'll need someday, he used to say. At the time, I thought it was just another one of his habits. Now I wasn't so sure. I carried the entire stack to the dining room table. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, only the ticking of the old grandfather clock kept me company. Hour after hour, I sorted every envelope. Insurance policies, boat registration renewals, engine maintenance records, fishing licenses dating back almost 30 years. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why my husband had protected an old fishing boat with his dying breath. Then I found something strange. There was a gap. Not a missing document. An entire missing year. Harold had carefully saved records from every year of our marriage, except one. 1998. The folder existed. The label was there, but it was completely empty. I frowned. That made no sense. Harold wasn't forgetful. If anything, he was obsessively organized. An empty folder wasn't an accident. Someone had removed its contents.
Slowly.
Deliberately. I searched every drawer again. Nothing. The papers from that year had vanished. As I sat there staring at the empty folder, a memory surfaced so suddenly that it made me put my hand over my mouth. October 1998. That had been the year Harold disappeared for 3 days. At the time, he told me he was helping an old friend repair a commercial fishing boat several counties away. Cell phones were uncommon then. He called only once. The connection was terrible. I remembered standing in our kitchen holding the telephone while static swallowed every other word. "I'll be home Sunday," he had said. Then the line went dead. When he returned, he looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I had asked if everything was all right. He smiled. "Everything's fine." I believed him, because I always believed him, until now. The more I thought about those missing 3 days, the more details returned. He had burned the clothes he wore that weekend. I remembered asking why. "They're covered in diesel," he answered. He also replaced the tires on his truck the following week, even though they were almost new. At the time, I never questioned either decision.
Now,
neither felt ordinary. I reached for the old family photo albums. Maybe there was something there. I flipped page after page. Christmas, camping trips, Daniel's graduation, birthdays, fishing tournaments. Then I found October of that same year. There were no photographs. Not one. Harold photographed everything. Yet somehow, the entire month had disappeared. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly felt colder. Someone had erased pieces of that year. Not by accident. On purpose. Just then the telephone rang. The loud sound startled me so badly, I nearly dropped the album. It was Daniel. "Hi, Mom." "Hello. You sound tired." "I've been organizing your father's papers." There was a pause. "Find anything interesting?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet." He laughed softly. "You know what Dad used to say.
What?
If you keep enough old papers, eventually someone will think you're hiding treasure." I smiled despite myself. He really did say that. Daniel became quiet. "Mom." "Yes. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you looking for answers? Or are you looking for Dad?" The question caught me completely off guard. For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Finally, I whispered, "I don't know." After we hung up, I kept thinking about what he had said. Maybe he was right. Maybe grief was making me invent mysteries where none existed. Maybe the missing folder had simply been misplaced years ago. Maybe the receipt meant nothing. Maybe Frank remembered the wrong man. Maybe. The human heart loves the word maybe. It protects us from certainty. Because certainty changes everything. Late that afternoon, I decided to visit the marina one more time. Not to search. Just to sit. The weather had cleared, leaving the water perfectly calm. Grace rocked gently against the dock. As I climbed aboard, I noticed something unusual. The cabin door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it the day before. Absolutely certain. I stepped inside. Nothing appeared disturbed. The chair remained tucked beneath the small folding table. The old lantern still hung from its hook. The shelves looked exactly as I had left them. I told myself I had simply forgotten to lock the door. Age makes people doubt their own memory. Still, something felt different. Almost instinctively, I looked down. Tiny wet footprints crossed part of the cabin floor. Not muddy, just damp. Someone had been inside recently. I knelt to examine them more closely. The prints weren't mine. My shoes had deeper tread. These were smooth-soled.
Fresh.
Very fresh. My heartbeat quickened. I stepped back outside and looked around the marina. Most of the slips were empty. Walter was nowhere to be seen. Frank was helping another boat owner near the fuel dock. No one appeared to be watching me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something else. One of the floor screws, the same row I had been studying, looked slightly brighter than the others, as though someone had turned it very recently, for the first time since Harold died. The mystery no longer belonged only to the past. Someone else might still know exactly what was hidden beneath that cabin floor. I stood inside the cabin for what felt like an hour, staring at that single screw. Anyone else would have dismissed it. A shiny screw among dozens of old ones. Nothing more. But when you spend nearly 10 years cleaning the same small room, you notice tiny changes. The lantern hanging an inch lower than before. A cup turned slightly to the left. Dust disturbed on a shelf no one had touched in months. And that screw, it had definitely been turned. I crouched beside it again. The wood surrounding the head was cleaner than the rest of the floor. Barely noticeable, but enough to convince me someone had placed a screwdriver there recently. Not years ago. Recently. I slowly stood and stepped back outside. The marina looked perfectly ordinary. A father was teaching his grandson how to tie a cleat hitch. Two fishermen argued about the weather. Someone started an old diesel engine that coughed twice before coming to life. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. I walked toward Frank's office. He looked up from a clipboard as I approached. "Everything all right, Martha? I need to ask you something." "Of course." "Has anyone been on my boat recently?" He frowned. "What makes you ask?" "I think someone was inside." Frank immediately became serious. "You saw someone?"
No.
"Anything missing?" "I don't think so." He scratched his beard. "I haven't noticed anyone." "Are there security cameras?" He nodded. "Near the entrance." "What about the docks?" "Only the main walkway." "So, the boats themselves aren't recorded?"
No.
He looked toward Grace. "Do you want me to change the lock?" I almost said yes. Then I remembered. If someone had entered the cabin, it probably wasn't because the lock had failed. It was because they already knew how to get inside. "No," I finally answered. "I'll think about it." On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in Harold's secret. For years, I believed the mystery belonged only to the past. Now I wasn't so sure. That evening I pulled out an old metal box where Harold kept spare keys. Garage.
Tool shed.
Truck. Mailbox.
Boat.
The key to Grace was exactly where it had always been, which meant one of two things. Either someone had made a copy years ago, or they hadn't needed a key at all. I barely slept. Every sound outside the house made me look toward the window. Around 6 the next morning, I made a decision. Instead of driving to the marina in the afternoon, like I usually did, I would arrive before sunrise. If someone was visiting the boat, perhaps they believed no one else ever came that early. The alarm rang at 4:30. The roads were almost empty. Fog floated above the water when I reached the marina. Frank's office was still dark. Only a few dock lights reflected across the harbor. I walked quietly toward Grace. Halfway down the pier, I stopped. The cabin light was on. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was absolutely certain I had switched that light off the previous afternoon.
It wasn't bright.
Just a soft yellow glow leaking through the dusty windows. Someone was inside. Every sensible part of me wanted to turn around and call the police. Instead, I kept walking. Slowly. Carefully. The wooden planks creaked beneath my feet. One step. Then another. The closer I came, the quieter everything felt. Even the seagulls seemed to have disappeared. I reached the side of the boat. The cabin door was closed. The light was still on. I listened. Nothing. No voices. No movement. Only the gentle sound of water touching the hull. I swallowed hard and placed one hand on the door handle. It was cold. Very slowly, I pushed. The door opened with its familiar groan. The cabin was empty. Completely empty. I stepped inside. The lantern on the table was lit. Not electric. The old oil lantern Harold always used during power outages. I stared at the small flame dancing behind the glass. Someone had lit it only minutes earlier. It couldn't have been burning long. The oil level was still high. The chimney wasn't even warm enough to darken with soot. Whoever had been there had just left. I turned in a full circle. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing looked damaged. Then I noticed something resting on the little folding table. A white envelope. No stamp. No address. Only 2 words written across the front in handwriting I had never seen before. For Martha. My mouth went dry. Hands trembling, I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only one sentence. If you're reading this, he kept his promise. No signature. No explanation. Nothing else. I read the sentence again. Then again. He kept his promise.
Not.
You kept yours.
Not.
Thank you.
He.
Meaning Harold. The letter wasn't meant for the past. It had been left now.
For me.
Someone knew I would eventually come looking. Someone knew my name. Someone knew Harold had made a promise. And whoever that person was, they had been sitting inside my husband's boat just moments before I arrived. For several minutes, I couldn't move. The letter rested in my hands, impossibly light for something that suddenly felt heavier than everything Harold had left behind. If you're reading this, he kept his promise. I read those words over and over until they almost lost their meaning. Who was he? I already knew the answer. Harold. But what promise? The one he made to me? Or another promise? One he had never spoken about? I turned the paper over. Blank. Held it against the lantern. Nothing hidden inside. No watermark. No second message. Just one sentence. Deliberately short. Deliberately mysterious. I looked around the cabin again. Every corner suddenly felt different. The narrow bench where Harold used to drink coffee. The small cabinet where he kept fishing hooks. The shelf where an old compass had sat untouched for years. Someone had been standing exactly where I was standing now. Someone who knew I would eventually come. I hurried outside. The marina was beginning to wake. A truck pulled into the parking lot. 2 men unloaded coolers from the back of a pickup. Somewhere farther down the dock, an engine roared to life. Everything looked completely ordinary. Too ordinary. I walked quickly toward Frank's office. He had just unlocked the front door when he saw me. Martha. I held up the envelope. I found this. His expression changed immediately. Where? Inside Grace. He took the paper carefully and adjusted his glasses. His eyes narrowed as he read it. That's strange. You've never seen this handwriting before? He shook his head.
No.
What about the envelope? He studied it for another moment. Nothing special. I crossed my arms. Frank. Yes. Someone was inside my boat. I believe you. They left this for me. I know. They knew my name. He looked toward the docks. I don't like that. Neither did I. Frank walked outside and slowly scanned the marina. There aren't many people who even know that boat belongs to you anymore.
His words stopped me.
What do you mean? Most of the old crowd is gone. Gone. Retired. Moved away, passed on. He sighed quietly. Your husband belonged to another generation here. I looked back toward Grace. So, whoever left that letter probably knew Harold. Frank nodded. I'd say that's a safe assumption. On my drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. If someone knew Harold, why wait almost 10 years? Why not contact me after the funeral? Why not simply knock on my door? Why leave a cryptic note inside an abandoned boat? Nothing about it made sense. That afternoon, I decided to do something I should have done long ago. I visited Harold's younger sister, Eleanor. We had always gotten along well, but after Harold died, our visits became less frequent. Life has a cruel way of shrinking families one funeral at a time. She welcomed me with a warm hug. I wasn't expecting you. I know. We sat at her kitchen drinking tea while rain tapped softly against the windows. For nearly half an hour, we talked about ordinary things. Her garden, Daniel, the weather. Neither of us mentioned Harold. Finally, I reached into my purse and placed the envelope on the table. Eleanor, I need to ask you something. She looked at the paper. What is it? Did Harold ever have a close friend, someone he met every October? She frowned. Every October? I nodded. I recently learned he met the same man for years. She looked genuinely surprised. I've never heard of that. What about before we married? She leaned back, thinking. Your husband wasn't a man with many friends. I know. He had coworkers, neighbors, fishing buddies.
She stopped.
Then her expression changed.
What?
There was one man. My heart skipped.
Who?
I don't remember his last name. What was his first name? She stared toward the window. Thomas. The name meant nothing to me. Who was he? They worked together for a while. Where? At the shipyard. I've never heard Harold mention him. You probably wouldn't.
Why?
Eleanor hesitated. They had some kind of falling out. When? Oh. She thought for another moment. A very long time ago. What happened? I honestly don't know. You never ask? She smiled sadly. You knew my brother. I nodded. He wasn't exactly eager to explain himself. She laughed quietly. No. He certainly wasn't. Before I left, Eleanor disappeared into a spare bedroom. When she returned, she carried an old photo album. I almost forgot. She opened it carefully. This was taken at the shipyard picnic. There were dozens of workers standing together beside the water. I leaned closer. Eleanor pointed toward a young Harold. There. He looked no older than 30. Standing beside him was a tall man wearing a dark baseball cap. I felt the air leave my lungs. Even though the picture was decades old, I recognized the posture immediately. It was the same man I had seen in the blurry Marina photograph. The same height, the same broad shoulders, the same habit of standing with his hands in his jacket pockets. That's Thomas, Eleanor said. I barely whispered. Do you know where he is now? She slowly shook her head. I haven't heard that name in at least 25 years. I couldn't stop staring at the photograph. Whoever Thomas was, he hadn't disappeared from Harold's life after all. He had simply moved from the shipyard to the cabin of an old fishing boat. And somehow, even after Harold's death, his story wasn't finished. I asked Eleanor if I could borrow the photo. She didn't hesitate. Of course, she said, sliding the album across the table. Just bring it back whenever you're finished. I carefully removed the picture and held it under the kitchen light. There was Harold, young,
Strong.
smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. Beside him stood Thomas. Unlike Harold, Thomas wasn't smiling. His expression was calm, almost guarded, as though he had noticed the camera a second before the shutter clicked. What was he like? I asked. Eleanor shrugged. I only met him twice. And he seemed polite.
She paused.
But your brother never invited many people into his life. I know. They worked together for several years at the shipyard. What did Thomas do there? I think he was a welder. I nodded. And then? I don't know. You never heard Harold mention him again? She looked down into her teacup. Not after the accident. I looked up immediately. What accident? Eleanor's eyes widened. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. I leaned forward. What accident? She looked genuinely uncomfortable. I honestly don't know much. Tell me what you do know. She took a deep breath. I remember hearing that something happened at the shipyard. What? I don't know. Someone got hurt? I think so. Who? I really don't know, Martha. She rubbed her temples, trying to remember. I only know Harold came home different after that. Different how? Quieter. I almost laughed. Harold was always quiet.
No.
She shook her head. You married the quiet version. Those words settled heavily between us. The Harold I grew up with, she continued, used to tell stories for hours. He loved making people laugh. I stared at her. That wasn't the man I had known. Not even close. When did he change? I think. She searched her memory. Around that same time. The accident. She nodded. I believe so. I drove home with more questions than answers. An accident. A missing year of documents. A mysterious friend. Secret meetings every October. A promise. A hidden compartment beneath the cabin floor. And now, an anonymous letter. Individually, none of those things proved anything. Together, they no longer felt like coincidence. That evening I spread everything across my dining room table. The old receipt, Harold's journal, the anonymous letter, the photograph from the shipyard, the marina picture, the empty 1998 folder. For the first time, I stopped looking at them separately. Instead, I imagined them as pieces of the same story. What if the fishing boat had never been the secret? What if it had only been the place where the secret was protected?
Just then my phone rang.
It was Walter. I stopped by the marina today, he said. Oh, Frank told me you've been asking questions. I smiled faintly. The whole marina probably knows by now. Probably. There was a brief silence. Then he asked quietly, did you ever lift the floor?
No.
Why not? Because I promised Harold. Walter didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, sometimes promises have expiration dates. His words surprised me. I don't believe that. I used to. What changed your mind? I spent too many years protecting someone else's secret. I sat upright. What do you mean? Walter sighed softly. Not over the phone. When can we talk? If you're free tomorrow morning. I am. I'll meet you at the marina. Before hanging up, he added one final sentence. Bring Harold's journal. The line went dead. The next morning arrived colder than expected. A thick fog covered the harbor, making the boats appear like shadows floating in white silence. Walter was already there. He stood beside his sailboat holding 2 cups of coffee. You came. You sounded serious. I am. We walked slowly toward Grace without speaking. Only after we stepped aboard did Walter finally begin. I've repaired old boats for 40 years. I know. I've also seen hundreds of hidden compartments. I looked at him. They were common? Very. For what? Tools. Cash. Important papers. He smiled slightly. Sometimes things people never wanted anyone else to find. I swallowed. So, you think Harold built one? I think he paid someone to. I handed him the receipt. He examined it for only a few seconds before nodding. Custom brass hinges. What does that tell you? It tells me the floor wasn't repaired. It was redesigned. I felt my heart beating faster. Walter knelt near the same row of screws. Without touching them, he simply studied the wood. You've cleaned this floor for years, haven't you? Yes. And never noticed anything. Never. That's exactly how hidden compartments are supposed to work. He stood again. I can remove these screws. I looked at the floor. Then at Harold's journal in my hands. Then back at Walter. I don't know if I should. Walter nodded. I understand. No. I shook my head. I really don't. For almost 10 years, I had protected Harold's final request. Opening that floor felt like breaking the last promise I had left to keep. Yet every new clue seemed to point toward the same place. Not away from the boat.
Toward it.
Walter rested one hand gently on my shoulder. I won't touch a single screw unless you ask me to. I closed my eyes. Harold's voice echoed in my memory. Promise me you'll never sell it.
Nah.
Promise me you'll never open it. I opened my eyes again. For the first time, I realized those 2 promises were not the same. And somehow, that small difference changed everything. I stood there without saying a word. Walter waited patiently beside me, his hands resting on the edge of the cabin table. He wasn't pressuring me. He wasn't trying to convince me. He simply understood that some decisions belong to the person carrying the promise. I looked around the tiny cabin one more time. Every inch of it held Harold's fingerprints, the hooks he had installed himself, The lantern he insisted on using even after I bought him a battery-powered light. The small crack in the window frame he always said he'd fix next spring. Next spring never came. I closed my eyes and tried to hear his voice. Not the weak voice from the hospital. The younger one. The confident one. The one that filled our kitchen on Saturday mornings while he hummed old country songs completely out of tune. If he were standing here, would he be angry? Or was this exactly what he had been waiting for? The anonymous letter suddenly came back to my mind. If you're reading this, he kept his promise. Not, you broke yours. That sentence mattered. Whoever had written it wasn't accusing me of betrayal. Almost the opposite. It felt like permission. I slowly opened Harold's journal again. The page with the strange sentence was still marked by an old receipt. Some promises protect people. Others protect the truth. I read it aloud. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. What? He doesn't say which kind this promise was. I looked at him. What do you think? I think. He paused. If opening that floor could hurt someone today, your husband would never have left clues leading you to it. I hadn't thought of it that way. Every clue had appeared naturally. The receipt, the journal, Frank's memories, Thomas, the letter. Nothing had forced me here. Everything had guided me here, as though someone had expected this exact moment. I took a slow breath. Walter. Yes, if we open it, we do it carefully. He smiled. Of course. From his toolbox, he removed an old manual screwdriver instead of a power drill. Less chance of damaging the wood. He knelt beside the loose row of screws. I'll stop the second you tell me. I nodded. The first screw turned with almost no resistance. A soft metallic click echoed through the silent cabin. It sounded much louder than it should have. Almost ceremonial. The second screw came out just as easily. Then the third. Neither of us spoke. Even the harbor outside seemed unusually quiet. When the final screw was removed, Walter carefully slid the screwdriver aside. He looked up at me. Would you like to do the honors? My hands trembled. I knelt beside him. The wooden panel didn't move at first. I slipped my fingers beneath the edge. Slowly, very slowly, I lifted. The panel rose less than an inch before stopping. Something underneath caught it. Walter reached over gently. There. He pointed toward a small brass latch hidden beneath the edge. So that's what the custom hinges were for. I carefully released the latch. This time the panel lifted completely. A narrow compartment appeared beneath the floor. Neither of us said a word. Inside, there was no money, no gold, no jewelry. Only one weatherproof metal box. Dark green, about the size of a shoebox. It looked military. The lid showed scratches from decades of use. Across the front, a small brass nameplate had been removed long ago. Only the empty rivet holes remained. Walter quietly stepped back. I think this belongs to you. I reached inside. The box was surprisingly heavy. Not impossibly heavy. Just solid. Like it contained paper instead of metal. Or several things wrapped together. There was a small padlock attached to the front. Locked. I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because Harold had managed to keep one more secret. Of course he had. Walter smiled. He really didn't trust Easy. No. I ran my fingers across the cold metal. He never did. Then something caught my attention. Taped to the underside of the wooden floor panel, hidden where no one would ever see it unless they opened the compartment, was another envelope. This one looked much older. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Harold's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. For Martha, only if I'm gone. The world seemed to stop. My throat tightened. My vision blurred. For 10 years, his final words had been waiting beneath my feet. Not lost. Not forgotten. Waiting. I carefully removed the envelope without opening it. Walter quietly walked toward the cabin door. I'll wait outside. You don't want to know? He smiled kindly. No. Some letters belong to one person. He stepped onto the deck, gently closing the door behind him. For the first time since Harold died, it felt as though we were alone together again. Just him and me, separated only by a single envelope that had spent decades hidden beneath the floor of an old fishing boat. For a long time, I simply held the envelope. I didn't open it. I couldn't. My fingers traced Harold's handwriting over and over, as though touching those familiar letters might somehow bring him back for one more conversation. For Martha, only if I'm gone. He hadn't written my name in years. Toward the end of his illness, his hands shook too much to write anything longer than a grocery list. Yet here it was.
Strong. Steady.
Written long before he ever became sick. That realization sent a chill through me. This hadn't been prepared during his final days. Harold had hidden this letter years earlier. Long before cancer. Long before hospital rooms. Long before either of us imagined death was waiting. He had always planned for me to find it. Eventually, my eyes filled with tears. Not because of the mystery. Because I suddenly understood something that had never occurred to me before. Harold had known this burden might one day become mine. And he had tried, in the only way he knew how, to make sure I wouldn't face it completely alone. I sat down on the little bench inside the cabin. The same bench where he used to drink coffee before sunrise. Outside, I could hear the gentle tapping of waves against the hull. Everything else had disappeared. There was only the envelope. Slowly, I slid one finger beneath the flap. The old glue gave way with almost no resistance. Inside was a folded letter. Several pages. Written on lined yellow paper. The first line stole the air from my lungs. My dearest Martha, if you are reading this, it means I have failed at the one thing I wanted most, staying beside you until we both grew impossibly old. A tear rolled down my cheek before I reached the second sentence. Harold had never been a man of speeches. He loved quietly. He apologized quietly. He even laughed quietly. Yet the words on those pages carried more emotion than I had heard from him in 40 years. I know opening this compartment means you have reached a point where the questions became heavier than the promise. If that day has come, then you deserve the truth. I stopped reading. Just for a moment.
I pressed the paper against my chest.
For years I had worried that opening the compartment meant betraying him. Instead, Harold had expected it, wanted it. He had simply hoped it wouldn't happen until the time was right. I continued reading. The boat was never the secret. The compartment was never the secret. Those were only locks. The real secret has always been inside the green box. My eyes immediately shifted toward the metal case resting beside my feet. The lock suddenly seemed far more important than before. Harold continued. I could never trust the box to a bank. Banks fail. People ask questions. Boxes disappear. I trusted only one person enough to guard it.
You.
Even though you never knew you were protecting it. I wiped my eyes. A sad smile crossed my face. Typical Harold. He had found a way to make me a guardian without ever asking me to understand what I was guarding. The next paragraph was different. The handwriting became slightly uneven. If you are angry with me, you have every right. I kept part of my life away from you. Not because I doubted your love, because I feared what knowing might cost you. My heart tightened. For the first time, I wondered if I truly wanted the answer. Some mysteries become beautiful simply because they remain mysteries. Truth has a way of replacing imagination with reality. And reality is not always kinder. I forced myself to continue. You are probably wondering about Thomas. I froze. He knew. He knew I would eventually learn that name. Thomas did nothing wrong. If anyone deserves blame, it is me. I stared at those words. Harold. Blame? For what? The next sentence made my hands begin to shake. The accident everyone remembers was not the worst thing that happened that October. I could hear my own breathing.
Slow.
Uneven. The pages trembled in my hands. Harold had finally reached the story he had buried for almost 30 years. But before explaining anything, he ended the page with one final instruction. Do not open the green box until you finish reading every word of this letter. Otherwise, nothing that follows will make sense. I looked down at the locked metal box. It suddenly felt alive, as though everything I believed about my husband had been sleeping inside it for decades. I wanted to force the lock open immediately, Instead, I took a deep breath, folded my hands, and turned to the next page. Whatever Harold had carried alone all those years, I was finally ready to carry it with him. The next page began with a date, October 18th, 1998. I stared at it for several seconds. The missing year, the empty folder, the same October Frank remembered, the same October Eleanor had mentioned, the same October Harold disappeared for 3 days. Everything was finally beginning to connect. My dear Martha, before I tell you what happened, there is one thing I need you to believe. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Nothing you are about to read changes that. I smiled through tears. Only Harold would think of reassuring me before confessing something that had haunted him for nearly 30 years. I have carried this weight alone because I believed that was the price I deserved to pay. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I only stole years from us that should have been lived without this silence. The handwriting became slower, more deliberate. Thomas was my best friend. I stopped. Best friend. Not coworker. Not acquaintance. Best friend. How had I never heard those words? How had someone so important simply disappeared from every conversation we ever had? Harold continued. We met during our first month at the shipyard. Neither of us knew much. Both of us pretended we knew everything. He became the brother I never had. A tear landed on the paper. I remembered how lonely Harold always seemed when talking about his childhood. Perhaps Thomas had filled a place in his life I had never realized existed. We built boats together, worked overtime together, fished together almost every weekend. When I met you, Thomas was the first person I told. I laughed softly despite the tears. I had imagined Harold proposing to me with quiet confidence. Now I pictured 2 young men sitting on an overturned crate, talking about a girl named Martha. It somehow made him feel younger than I had ever known him. You once asked why I never had a best man at our wedding. I told you Thomas had moved away. That was my first lie. I closed my eyes. I remembered asking exactly that. His answer had sounded so simple, so believable. 1 sentence, 1 lie, strong enough to survive an entire marriage. He didn't move. He couldn't. My stomach tightened. The next sentence came slowly. There was an accident at the shipyard. There it was again. The accident. Only now, Harold was finally willing to speak about it. We were repairing the hull of an old trawler that had been damaged in a storm. The job should never have been approved. Too many shortcuts had been taken. Too many warnings ignored. I could almost hear his voice as I read. There was a fuel leak beneath the engine compartment. No one knew. I felt my fingers grip the paper more tightly. Thomas climbed inside first. I followed him. Outside the cabin, a gull cried somewhere over the water. The sound startled me. For a moment, I looked toward the door before forcing myself back to the page. The explosion wasn't large, not compared to what people imagine, but inside a steel hull, it sounded like the end of the world. I stopped breathing. My ears rang so loudly, I couldn't hear Thomas screaming. My eyes filled again. When I finally reached him, part of the structure had collapsed. The words blurred through my tears. I tried to lift it. I couldn't. Another pause in the handwriting, as though even decades later, those memories still hurt to write. He told me to leave. I whispered aloud. Oh, Harold. I refused. I kept trying. I tore my hands open, pulling at twisted steel. I instinctively remembered Harold's scarred knuckles. He always claimed they came from years of welding. Maybe they hadn't. Then another explosion shook the hull. I could almost see it. Smoke. Darkness. Metal. Fire. He looked directly at me and shouted something I have never forgotten. The next line had been written larger than the rest. Go home to Martha. I covered my mouth. The tears came freely now. He smiled. Even then. I had never met Thomas, yet suddenly I mourned him. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. The page ended there. No explanation. No dramatic conclusion. Only silence. I turned the page carefully. The handwriting on the next sheet looked even shakier. Not because Harold had grown old, because remembering had cost him something. I survived. Thomas didn't. I stared at the sentence for a long time. So simple. So devastating. I spent years believing I had failed him. Maybe I had. Then came another sentence that changed everything. But Thomas didn't die because of the explosion. I frowned.
What?
I read it again. He didn't die because of the explosion. My heartbeat quickened. If the explosion hadn't killed him, then what had? Harold answered before I could even finish asking the question in my mind. He died because someone decided saving money was more important than fixing the fuel system. I leaned back against the cabin wall. This wasn't simply an accident. Someone had allowed it to happen. Someone had known. And suddenly, the green metal box beside my feet no longer looked like a container for old memories. It looked like evidence. Evidence someone had been willing to hide for nearly 3 decades. My eyes drifted from the letter to the green metal box. Evidence. The word echoed inside my mind. Not memories. Not keepsakes. Evidence. I suddenly understood why Harold had never trusted a bank, or a lawyer, or even his own family. If the box contained proof that someone had knowingly caused Thomas's death, it could have disappeared forever. I returned to the letter. My greatest mistake was believing the truth would eventually reveal itself. Harold had underlined the word eventually. It didn't. The company called it a tragic accident. There was an investigation. There were hearings. There were promises. But before long, everyone moved on. Except him. I didn't need Harold to write those words. I already knew. He had never moved on. People told me I was lucky to be alive. I never felt lucky. I attended Thomas's funeral. I stood beside his parents. I listened while company representatives spoke about fate, bad luck, unavoidable circumstances. The handwriting became noticeably heavier. They lied. I had never seen Harold write with such anger. Not once. I knew they lied because Thomas and I had reported the fuel leak 2 weeks earlier. My heart stopped. I read the sentence again. 2 weeks earlier. They had known. Someone had known. We filed the report together. We signed it together. We handed it directly to our supervisor. I closed my eyes. Everything suddenly became painfully clear. The explosion had not been unexpected. It had been ignored. They thanked us. They promised repairs. They never shut the vessel down. Outside, the wind picked up, gently rocking Grace against the dock. The cabin creaked softly around me. For the first time, I felt as though Harold himself was sitting beside me, not as a ghost, but as the young man who had carried this memory alone for almost 30 years. The morning after Thomas died, our report disappeared. I whispered, "No." Harold answered from the page. It simply vanished. The company claimed no record had ever existed. The supervisor denied receiving it. The maintenance office denied scheduling repairs. Without that report, Thomas's death became nobody's fault. I lowered the paper. The green box. Of course. The report. Harold had saved it. Or a copy of it. I suddenly remembered something Daniel had once joked about. Dad keeps copies of everything. At the time, we laughed. Now, it no longer seemed like a harmless habit. It seemed like preparation. Harold continued. I had made one copy. Only one. I kept it because something inside me feared exactly what happened. I smiled sadly. Typical Harold. Always expecting paperwork to matter. Always believing documents outlived excuses. I wanted to give the copy to Thomas's parents. I almost did. But before I could, someone came looking for it. A chill ran through me. Someone. Not lawyers. Not investigators. Someone. The first visit happened 3 nights after the funeral. There was a knock on our apartment door. I frowned. Apartment. I had forgotten Harold and I lived in a tiny apartment before buying our house. It was my supervisor. He apologized. He asked how I was sleeping. He asked whether I needed anything. He never once mentioned Thomas. The next sentence was short. Before leaving, he asked if I had kept any paperwork. I felt my pulse quicken. Harold had understood immediately. He smiled while asking, but his eyes weren't smiling. I told him no. He looked around the apartment anyway. I instinctively glanced toward the cabin windows, almost expecting someone to be standing outside. The feeling of being watched returned. That was the night I decided the copy could never stay inside our home. I looked again at the metal box.
Grace.
The fishing boat. Everything finally made sense. Not because the boat was special, because it was ordinary. Nobody searches an old fishing boat, especially one owned by a quiet welder who spent weekends catching bass. I bought Grace 6 months later. Not because he wanted a boat, because he needed a hiding place. My friends believed I had developed a love for fishing. I let them believe it. The boat became my excuse. My sanctuary. My vault. A tear slipped onto the page. For decades, every fishing trip, every quiet morning on the water, every hour he spent sitting alone inside this cabin, had never been about fish. He had been checking on the truth, protecting it. I met Thomas's father here every October. There it was. Frank's mysterious visitor. Not Thomas. His father. We opened the compartment. We checked the documents. We made sure everything remained dry. Then we closed it again. Year after year. For decades. The annual meetings. The mysterious man. Everything fit together perfectly. Until one final sentence shattered the peace I had finally begun to feel. When Thomas's father died, he asked someone else to continue watching over the box. I slowly lowered the letter. Someone else. Not Harold. Not Thomas. Who was still alive. Who knew exactly what was inside the green metal box. Who almost certainly had been the person leaving anonymous letters inside my husband's boat. I could no longer hear the water, or the gulls, or the distant hum of engines from the marina. The world had narrowed to 3 things: Harold's letter, the green metal box, and one sentence that refused to leave my mind. When Thomas's father died, he asked someone else to continue watching over the box. Someone else. Someone still alive. Someone who knew exactly where this compartment was hidden. Someone who had walked into this cabin only days earlier. The anonymous letter suddenly made perfect sense. If you're reading this, he kept his promise. It hadn't been written by a stranger. It had been written by the next guardian. Someone who had inherited the responsibility after Thomas's father passed away. I folded Harold's letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I carried the green box outside, where Walter was sitting quietly on the edge of the dock with his coffee. He looked up. "You opened the letter." I did. And I rested the heavy box on the deck between us. It wasn't what I expected. It rarely is. I sat beside him. For a long time neither of us spoke. Finally I asked, "Walter." "Yes. If someone spent 30 years protecting something, would they ever simply disappear?" He looked toward the horizon before answering.
No.
They'd make sure someone else could continue. I nodded slowly. That's exactly what happened. Walter glanced at the box. "So, whoever left that note already knows you've found this?" "I believe so." He frowned. "Which means they may come back."
The thought should have frightened me.
Instead, it gave me hope. For the first time, I realized I wasn't chasing a ghost. I was following a trail left by living people. People who had spent decades honoring the same promise Harold had carried. Walter finally pointed toward the lock. "Do you have the key?" I almost laughed.
No.
I didn't think so. He picked up the box and examined it carefully. The padlock was old. Very old. The brass had darkened with age, but it showed almost no rust. Someone had taken care of it. Regularly. Walter turned it over. Then stopped. "Look." He pointed beneath the handle. Scratched into the metal were 2 tiny letters. TF. I immediately remembered.
Thomas.
Thomas's last name. Or perhaps Thomas and Harold together. "I never noticed that before," I whispered. "Neither would anyone else." Walter smiled. It wasn't meant to be obvious. He looked more closely at the lock. "This isn't original." "It isn't."
No.
"The box is much older than this lock." I looked surprised. "How can you tell?" The hinges. He pointed with one finger. They've aged differently. He paused. This lock was replaced. When? I couldn't tell you. But not recently. That small observation opened another question. If the lock had been changed, who changed it? Harold? Thomas's father? Or the mysterious guardian who now seemed to know everything? Back at home, I spread Harold's letter across the dining room table and read it again from the beginning. This time, I wasn't searching for emotion. I was searching for details.
Dates. Names.
Places. Anything I had missed the first time. Halfway through the letter, one sentence caught my attention. It was so ordinary that I had almost ignored it before. If anything ever happens to me before the truth is safe, the key will remain where it always belonged. I stopped.
The key.
Harold had written about the key, but where had it always belonged? He hadn't explained. At first I assumed another page would answer the question. It didn't. I read the entire letter again. Nothing. Just that single sentence. The key will remain where it always belonged. I stood and walked slowly through the house. Where had something always belonged to Harold? His toolbox? The garage? His desk? His fishing jacket? The old tackle box? Every object suddenly seemed like a possibility. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years. Fishing lures. Old reels.
Maps.
Flashlights. Nothing. Then I remembered something so small that I almost dismissed it. Harold had owned the same pocket knife since before we married. A worn brown leather sheath. Wooden handle polished smooth by decades of use. He never went anywhere without it. Fishing.
Camping.
Working in the garage. Even church picnics. After he died, I had placed it inside the top drawer of his dresser. Untouched. Exactly where he had left it. I hurried upstairs. The knife was still there. I picked it up carefully. It felt strangely heavy. Heavier than I remembered. Perhaps memory was playing tricks on me. Still, something didn't feel right. I turned it over in my hands. The handle looked slightly thicker near one end. Almost as if it were hollow. My heart began beating faster. Harold had taught me one lesson without ever saying it aloud. When something feels ordinary for decades, that is often exactly how it was designed to feel. I pressed gently against the brass cap at the end of the handle. Nothing. I twisted it. Still nothing. Then I noticed a tiny groove, so small it was almost invisible. I slipped the blade of another knife inside. The brass cap moved. Barely. But it moved. Very slowly. The end of the handle unscrewed. Inside, wrapped tightly in waxed cloth, was a tiny brass key, smaller than my little finger, perfectly preserved, and attached to it, a faded paper tag, in Harold's handwriting, for the box. When the time is right. I held the tiny brass key in the palm of my hand for a long time. It couldn't have weighed more than a few ounces. Yet somehow, it felt heavier than the green metal box itself. For nearly 30 years, Harold had carried this secret inside the handle of an ordinary pocket knife. A knife I had picked up hundreds of times. A knife I had cleaned. A knife I had placed into drawers whenever I dusted the bedroom. Never once suspecting that the one thing capable of opening the greatest mystery of our marriage had been resting quietly in my own home. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly Harold. He never believed the safest place was the most complicated one. He believed the safest place was the one everyone overlooked. I carefully wrapped the key again, not because I feared losing it, because suddenly every movement felt important. Every decision felt like part of something much larger than myself. That afternoon I returned to the marina. Walter was repairing a loose cleat on his sailboat when he saw me walking toward him. "You found something." I opened my hand. The tiny brass key caught the sunlight. Walter smiled. "I was hoping you would." "You knew." I suspected.
How?
He wiped his hands on a rag. Men like Harold always separated the key from the lock. I looked at him. "You've seen this before?" "More than once." "Not this story." He smiled. "But similar men." We climbed aboard Grace together. The green metal box waited exactly where I had left it, resting on the small folding table inside the cabin. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt respectful, almost sacred. I inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. For a second, I hesitated. Walter noticed. Still thinking about the promise? I nodded. I keep wondering, what if opening this changes the way I remember Harold? Walter thought carefully before answering. The truth doesn't change who someone was. It only explains why.
His words settled inside me.
Slowly, I turned the key. The lock resisted at first. Then came a dull metallic click, a sound that had waited almost 30 years to be heard. I removed the padlock and lifted the lid. The hinges groaned softly.
Inside,
there was no treasure, no stacks of money, no hidden fortune. Instead, everything had been arranged with extraordinary care. Plastic sleeves, wax-sealed envelopes, photographs, several cassette tapes, a leather notebook, and, resting on top of everything else, a folded sheet of paper. Across the front, in Harold's handwriting, one sentence: "Start here." My hands trembled as I unfolded it. If this box has been opened, then I am no longer here to explain it myself. I swallowed hard. Nothing inside belongs to me. It belongs to Thomas. Walter quietly stepped farther away, again giving me privacy. I continued reading. The world remembers Thomas as a victim of an industrial accident, but that is not who he was. He was a son, a brother, a husband, a father who never had the chance to watch his little girl grow up. I closed my eyes.
a daughter.
Thomas had left behind a child. Harold continued, "If you have opened this box, please finish what I could not." Those words landed like a stone. Finish what I could not. I looked down at the documents beneath the letter. Suddenly they no longer felt like old papers. They felt like responsibility. I carefully lifted the first plastic folder. Inside was the missing report, the original maintenance complaint, dated exactly 2 weeks before the explosion, signed by both Harold and Thomas. I stared at the signatures. There they were, side by side, real, undeniable. The ink had faded slightly with age, but every word remained perfectly readable. Directly beneath it lay another document, an engineering inspection, highlighted in red. The words practically leaped from the page. Immediate shutdown recommended. Risk of catastrophic fuel ignition. I covered my mouth. Someone had known, not suspected.
Known.
I turned another page. Internal company memo.
Marked.
Confidential. It instructed supervisors to postpone repairs until the next financial quarter because replacing the fuel system would exceed the maintenance budget. I felt physically sick. Thomas hadn't died because nobody knew. He had died because someone had calculated the cost of repairs and decided it was too expensive. A tear landed on the paper, then another. For nearly 30 years, Harold had carried proof of that decision. Proof that one human life had been measured against a budget. I heard Walter's footsteps approaching slowly. He stopped beside me. Without reading the documents, he asked quietly, "Is it what you expected?" I looked up at him.
No.
"What is it?" I struggled to answer. "It's worse. Much worse. Because this wasn't simply evidence of negligence. It was evidence that someone had chosen profit, knowing exactly what that choice might cost." I carefully placed the papers back inside the folder. Then my eyes fell upon something I hadn't noticed before. At the very bottom of the box, beneath every document, lay a small family photograph. Thomas, a young woman standing beside him, and, between them, a little girl no older than 4. She was smiling at the camera while holding a tiny stuffed bear. On the back of the photograph, Harold had written only one sentence: "I hope she finally knows the truth." I stared at those words for a very long time. Then I whispered the question that had suddenly become more important than every other mystery. Where is Thomas's daughter now? I could not stop looking at the little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Her hair was tied into 2 uneven pigtails, and she hugged a worn teddy bear with both arms, as though it were the most valuable thing in the world. Thomas stood proudly behind her, one hand resting gently on his wife's shoulder. None of them knew the photograph would become the last family portrait they would ever take together. I turned it over once more. I hope she finally knows the truth. Harold had written those words years after the picture was taken. I could tell by the ink. It matched the pen he had started using after we moved into our house, long after Thomas had died. That meant one thing. Harold had never stopped thinking about that little girl. Not for decades. I looked back inside the box. Beneath the photograph was another envelope. This one was addressed differently. For Emily. Emily. I whispered the name aloud. So that's her. Walter looked at me. Who's Emily? Thomas's daughter. He nodded respectfully, but didn't ask another question. The envelope had never been opened. The seal remained perfectly intact despite the passing years. I ran my thumb across the paper. Harold had intended this letter for her. Not for me. Not for Thomas's parents. For the little girl who had grown up without a father. I wasn't sure whether I had the right to read it. Then I noticed something written in much smaller letters beneath her name. If no one can find her, Martha, please read this. A lump formed in my throat. Even now, Harold had been thinking ahead. He had imagined every possibility. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page. My dear Emily, if this letter has reached you, then someone finally cared enough to keep searching. You probably don't remember me. You were too young. But I remember you. I remember the way you ran across the dock wearing bright yellow rain boots that were 2 sizes too big. I remember you insisting your father could catch the biggest fish in the entire harbor. I remember you laughing every time he pretended to lose. I smiled through my tears. Harold had noticed everything, even the smallest details. I have wanted to tell you the truth for most of your life. Not because your father needs defending. Good people always defend themselves through the lives they lived. I wanted you to know because no child should grow up believing their father died because of bad luck. I stopped reading. Outside the cabin, the afternoon breeze stirred the old American flag hanging near the marina office. Its gentle flapping was the only sound. I continued. Your father was brave. More than brave. On the day of the explosion, he saved my life. If I am alive to write these words, it is because he chose me instead of himself. The tears came again. Harold had carried survivor's guilt for nearly 30 years. Yet Thomas had never blamed him. According to the letter, Thomas had made the choice himself. I have replayed that morning thousands of times. I have imagined making different decisions. Running faster. Lifting harder. Ignoring his orders. None of those dreams changed what happened. The handwriting became uneven. I am sorry that I could never find the courage to tell you this face to face. I was afraid, not for myself, for you. I lowered the page. Afraid for her?
Why?
The answer came only a few lines later. The people responsible still held influence for many years. I feared that reopening the case while you were growing up would only bring more pain into your family's life. That explained everything. Harold hadn't stayed silent because he was weak. He had believed he was protecting Thomas's family. Perhaps he had been right. Perhaps he had been wrong. But every decision had come from love. Never from fear alone. The final paragraph was unlike anything Harold had ever said to me. If you are reading this as an adult, I hope life has been kind to you. I hope you found reasons to smile that had nothing to do with the past. I hope someone told you that your father was a good man. If no one ever did, please believe me now. I carefully folded the letter. For several minutes, neither Walter nor I spoke. Finally, he asked quietly, "What will you do?" I looked at the photograph again. Emily. She would no longer be 4 years old. She would be in her 30s now. Perhaps married. Perhaps a mother herself. Perhaps living only a few towns away. Or perhaps on the other side of the country. I don't know, I admitted. Walter looked toward the water. Someone should know the truth. I agree. But first, he pointed gently toward the bottom of the box. There are still things you haven't seen. I looked down. Hidden beneath the stack of reports was a thin manila folder I had overlooked. Across the front, written in bold black marker, were 2 words that immediately made my stomach tighten. Private investigator. I slowly picked it up. The folder was much thicker than the others. Inside, Someone had spent years quietly searching for a little girl named Emily, and, judging by the number of documents inside, Harold had never stopped looking. The folder was thicker than every other document inside the box. Its edges were worn. Several corners had been reinforced with transparent tape. Someone had opened it dozens of times over the years. Harold. I slowly untied the faded cotton string wrapped around it. The first page wasn't a report. It was an invoice. A private investigator named Richard Collins. Date: March 2002. Below his name, one sentence had been typed. Subject: Emily Thomas Walker. Walker. For the first time, I knew her full name. Harold had searched for her. Not once. For years. I turned the page. The investigator's notes were meticulous. Address checks. School records. Property searches. Employment databases. Marriage records. Each report ended almost exactly the same way. No confirmed location. Subject relocated. Trail inactive. Another report. 2 years later. Another attempt.
Then,
No confirmed location. Then another. And another. Harold never stopped. He simply waited a few years. And searched again. I looked toward Walter. He hired someone. Walter nodded. For a long time, by the looks of it. I continued reading. One report mentioned that after Thomas died, his widow had sold the family home within 6 months. She left the state. No forwarding address. No known relatives nearby. The investigator believed she had deliberately disappeared from public records. Probably to start over. I couldn't blame her. If my husband had died that way, perhaps I would have done the same. Several pages later, another document caught my attention. This one had handwritten notes covering almost every margin. Harold's handwriting. He had underlined one sentence 3 different times. Emily graduated college. I smiled without realizing it. Harold had celebrated. Quietly. Alone. He had never met her again. Yet learning that she had finished college had been important enough for him to underline. Further down, another note read, "Bought first home." Beside it, a tiny check mark. Almost like a proud father reviewing a list of accomplishments. My eyes filled again. He had carried guilt, but he had also carried hope. Hope that Thomas's daughter had built a good life despite everything. Near the back of the folder, I found the final investigation, dated less than a year before Harold's cancer diagnosis. Unlike the others, this report was marked confidential, verified match. My heart began racing. Harold had found her. After all those years, he had finally found Emily. The report contained very little personal information, only enough to confirm her identity. A city, a profession, married, 1 daughter. Then I noticed something missing. The address had been carefully cut away. Not blacked out. Cut out. Someone had physically removed that portion of the page. Walter frowned. That's strange. It wasn't the investigator.
no.
The cut is too clean. I immediately knew who had done it. Harold. He had intentionally removed Emily's address.
But why?
If he had spent 20 years searching for her, why hide the one thing he had been trying to find? I searched the remaining pages. At the very end of the folder, a folded yellow note slipped onto the table, written only a few months before Harold died. My dear Martha, if you're holding this report, then I know you're wondering why I removed Emily's address. I did it because I changed my mind. For 20 years, I believed I should tell her everything. The closer I came, the less certain I became. I read more slowly. What if she had finally found peace? What if reopening the past only gave her another wound? The truth belongs to her, but the decision should never belong to me. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like Harold, always worrying about how his choices affected other people. He continued, "If you believe she deserves to know, then you must make that choice yourself. Not because of guilt, not because of me, only because your heart tells you it is the right thing to do." The note ended with one final sentence. "If you choose to look for her, you won't have to start from the beginning." Confused, I looked beneath the note. A small business card had been taped to the last page. Richard Collins, private investigator. Across the bottom, written in blue ink, "If Martha ever calls, help her finish what we started." The card was dated almost 9 years earlier. Walter slowly exhaled. He expected this day. He planned for it. I nodded. He planned for everything. I carefully placed the investigator's folder back into the box. Then I looked once more at the family photograph of Thomas, his wife, and little Emily. For the first time, Emily no longer felt like a mystery. She felt like unfinished family, not by blood, but by promise. And somewhere, completely unaware, Thomas's little girl was living her life, without knowing that an old fishing boat had protected the truth about her father for almost 30 years. That evening, I carried the green metal box into my living room. For nearly an hour, I simply sat beside it without touching a single document. The house was silent except for the old grandfather clock Harold had restored years ago. Every pendulum swing reminded me that time never waits for anyone, not for promises, not for regrets, not even for truth. I thought about Emily. Somewhere, she was probably making dinner for her family, perhaps helping her own daughter with homework, maybe laughing over something ordinary. She had no idea that an elderly widow was sitting hundreds of miles away, holding the story of her father inside an old military box. I wondered what I would do if someone appeared at my door tomorrow carrying the truth about my own father. Would I want to know? Or would I close the door and keep the life I had built untouched? There was no easy answer. I reached for Harold's final pages again. This time I noticed a folded sheet tucked inside the back cover of his letter. I hadn't seen it before. Across the top, he had written only 3 words. "If you're unsure." I unfolded it carefully. "My dear Martha, I know you better than anyone ever will. Right now, you're probably wondering whether searching for Emily would heal her or hurt her. I asked myself that same question for 27 years. I smiled sadly. Even now, he knew exactly what I would be thinking. I wish someone had answered it for me. No one ever could, because some decisions don't have right answers. They only have loving intentions." The next paragraph made my throat tighten. "If Emily is happy, please don't destroy that happiness because of my guilt. If Emily is searching, please don't leave her alone because of my fear." I whispered the sentence aloud. If Emily is searching. Searching. The words stayed with me. How many times had she wondered about her father? How many birthdays had she imagined what really happened? Had anyone told her it was simply an accident? Or had she always suspected something else? The telephone rang. The sound startled me. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "Hello, Martha." It was Frank. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Frank, is everything all right? I think someone came looking for you." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "A man." "What man?" "I've never seen him before." I stood. "What did he want?" "He asked if you still owned Grace." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." "What else?" "He wanted to know if you'd been visiting the boat lately." Cold spread through my chest. "Did he give a name?" "No." "What did he look like?" Frank thought for a moment. Late 60s. Tall. Gray jacket. Walked with a cane. None of those details meant anything. Then Frank added one more. He kept looking toward the cabin. Not the boat. The cabin. Exactly where the compartment had been hidden. What happened then? I asked if I could help him. And he smiled. What kind of smile? The kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I remembered Harold's description of his supervisor all those years earlier. He smiled, but his eyes weren't smiling. What did he do next? He thanked me, got into a dark sedan, and drove away. I looked instinctively toward the green metal box sitting beside my chair. Someone else knew, not just the anonymous guardian. Someone else. Someone who was asking questions. After hanging up, I immediately called Walter. He answered on the second ring. Everything all right? I quickly told him what Frank had seen. Walter remained silent until I finished. Then he asked one question. Did the man ask about the boat? Or the cabin? The cabin. Walter exhaled slowly. That's not good. You think he knows? I think He paused carefully. There are only two kinds of people who ask about hidden places. I waited. The ones protecting them. And the ones trying to make sure they're empty. Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. I walked to the window. Night had settled quietly over the neighborhood. Nothing looked unusual. Yet for the first time since opening the compartment, I no longer felt like I was uncovering history. History had begun moving toward me. I looked once more at the investigator's business card. Richard Collins. There was only one person still alive who knew more about Emily than I did. And, perhaps, the only person who could tell me whether finding her would bring peace or awaken dangers Harold had spent decades trying to keep buried. The following morning, before the sun had fully risen, I picked up the telephone and dialed the number Harold had saved almost 10 years earlier. Richard Collins answered on the fourth ring. His voice was older than I expected.
Calm.
Measured. The kind of voice belonging to someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. Richard Collins. For a second I almost hung up. How do you begin a conversation that has been waiting almost 30 years? My name is Martha Dawson. Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. A surprised one. Then he spoke very softly. Harold's wife. He hadn't asked. He already knew. Yes. I wondered if this day would ever come. I looked down at the green metal box resting beside my chair. So, Harold really talked about me? He talked about you often. That answer caught me off guard. What did he say? Richard chuckled quietly. He always ended every meeting the same way. What meetings? The ones where we discussed Emily. I closed my eyes. There were many? For almost 20 years. 20 years. Harold had been meeting this man for 2 decades, and I had never known. He loved you very much, Mrs. Dawson. The tears returned immediately. I know.
No.
Richard corrected gently. I don't think you know just how much. I couldn't answer. He continued. Every time I suggested telling you everything, he refused. Why? Because he believed you had already carried enough burdens. I thought about the hospital, the bills, my mother's illness, Daniel's struggles finding work. Harold had protected me from one more weight. Whether he was right or wrong, he had done it out of love. I found the box, I whispered. I assumed you had. And the letters. I hoped you would read every one before calling me. I did. There was another brief silence. Then Richard asked the question I had been expecting. Did you find Emily's photograph? Yes. And the investigator's reports? Yes. He sighed with relief. Good. What happens now? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked something unexpected. Did Harold leave you the second notebook? I frowned. The second notebook? Small. Brown leather.
No.
It should have been inside the box. I immediately opened the lid again. Folders. Letters. Photographs. Cassette tapes. The engineering reports. No notebook. I don't see it. Richard became very quiet. That's impossible. It isn't here. Harold would never separate it from the rest. A cold feeling settled over me. Someone had entered the cabin. Someone had left the anonymous note. Had they also taken something? Richard spoke again, his voice now much more serious. When did you open the box? Yesterday. And before that? Had anyone else reached the compartment? I don't know. I thought about the wet footprints, the brighter screw, the lit lantern, the anonymous envelope. I think someone was there before me. Richard didn't say anything for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, I was afraid of that. My heart began pounding. What was in the notebook? It wasn't evidence. What was it? It was Harold's personal journal. I frowned. I already found his journal.
No.
This one was different.
How?
It wasn't about Thomas. It was about you. I felt my breath catch. Me? Yes. He started writing after his diagnosis. He wanted you to have something, if he couldn't say everything himself. My chest tightened painfully. Another letter. Another part of Harold.
Gone.
Do you think someone stole it? I don't know, but if it disappeared, then whoever entered that compartment knew exactly what they were looking for. I slowly sat back down. Not random. Not vandalism. Not curiosity. Purpose. Someone had searched the compartment before I arrived. Richard's voice grew even quieter. Martha. Yes. There's something I never told Harold. I gripped the phone. What? I finally found Emily. I know.
No.
He interrupted gently. I found her again. I frowned. What do you mean? The last report Harold received is outdated. I stopped breathing. I kept searching.
Why?
Because I promised him I would. The room suddenly felt smaller. Is she
Alive?
Yes. The word came instantly. Relief flooded through me before I even realized I had been afraid. She's alive. She's well. And she still lives under the same married name. My eyes filled with tears. Harold would have smiled. After everything, she had built the life. Richard continued. I never contacted her. Why not? Because Harold asked me not to. Another promise. Another man keeping his word. But after Harold died, I wondered whether one day you might. I looked toward Thomas's family photograph. Little Emily, now a grown woman, perhaps with children of her own, perhaps telling them stories about a grandfather they never met, without knowing that another man had quietly spent decades trying to protect her father's name. Richard spoke once more. If you truly want to finish what Harold started, there's something you need to know before meeting her. What? The company responsible for Thomas's death doesn't exist anymore. I nodded slowly. I assumed that. It changed names. My stomach tightened. It merged. It was sold. But parts of it are still very much alive. I felt a chill run through my body. What are you saying? I'm saying someone may still have a reason to want Harold's documents to disappear. For the first time since opening the green box, I realized the story had never truly belonged to the past. Some people had simply been waiting for the past to stay buried forever. I remained seated for several minutes after Richard hung up. The telephone rested silently in my hand. Outside, nothing had changed. Children were riding bicycles past the house. A delivery truck stopped across the street. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower started. The world continued exactly as it always had. Yet mine had shifted once again. The company was gone. But the people, some of them were still alive. I walked back to the dining room and opened the green box once more. This time I wasn't looking for clues. I was looking for omissions. If someone had removed Harold's notebook, what else might be missing? I spread every document across the table. Engineering reports, maintenance requests, letters, photographs, cassette tapes. My eyes stopped on the tapes. There were 5 of them, each carefully labeled in Harold's handwriting. Interview 1. Interview 2. Thomas's father. Meeting, October. Personal. I frowned. Richard hadn't mentioned recordings. Neither had Harold's letter. I picked up the cassette marked Thomas's father. I hadn't owned a cassette player in years. Then I remembered. The old one in the garage. Harold had refused to throw it away. Everything comes back eventually, he used to joke. For the first time, I wondered if it hadn't been a joke at all. The player sat exactly where I remembered, on the top shelf above his workbench, covered in dust. After wiping it clean, I carried it into the house. The machine groaned when I plugged it in. For a terrifying second, I thought it no longer worked. Then the little red power light appeared. I carefully inserted the tape. Pressed play. Static. Several seconds of nothing.
Then
A voice. Older.
weak.
I suppose we're recording. Another voice answered. Harold. I think we should. I froze. It had been almost 10 years since I had heard him speak. Not in memories. Not in dreams. His real voice. Softer than I remembered.
Calmer.
I covered my mouth as tears immediately filled my eyes. The second voice spoke again. It belonged to an elderly man. Thomas's father. If Emily ever listens to this. He paused. Tell her I never stopped talking about her daddy. I closed my eyes. The room disappeared. I wasn't listening to evidence anymore. I was listening to grief, preserved on magnetic tape. Harold barely spoke during the recording. Mostly he listened. That was exactly who he had always been. Thomas's father continued. People said it was an accident. I knew better. They buried the paperwork. But they couldn't bury the truth. There was a long silence. Then Harold finally asked, "Do you regret not fighting harder?" The old man sighed. "Every day." Another pause. "But I regret something else even more." "What?" "Letting hatred steal years from Emily." I leaned closer. "I spent so much time chasing justice that I almost forgot to give my granddaughter joy." No one spoke for nearly half a minute. Finally, Harold whispered, "I'm sorry." The old man answered immediately, "No, you stayed." "I couldn't." "You could have walked away." "You didn't." I realized then. This yearly meeting had never been about documents alone. It had been two grieving men reminding each other why they kept going. The recording ended with something unexpected. Thomas's father laughed. Not loudly, just enough to sound peaceful. "If one day Martha hears this, tell her thank you." Harold sounded confused. "For what?" "For sharing you." My tears fell freely. "I borrowed your husband every October." "I know what that cost," Harold answered quietly. "She never complained." "That's because she didn't know." Both men laughed softly. Then the tape clicked to an end. I sat in complete silence. For years, I had unknowingly shared my husband with another grieving family, not because he loved them more, because he couldn't abandon them. I understood now why he always returned from the marina every October looking emotionally exhausted. He hadn't been fishing. He had been helping a father survive another year without his son. Just as I was placing the cassette back into its case, someone knocked on my front door. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not impatient, deliberate. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the front window. An older man stood on my porch.
Tall.
Gray jacket, wooden cane. Exactly as Frank had described. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking directly at the old fishing boat parked on the trailer beside my garage. Somehow, he already knew I had brought Grace home. Before I could decide whether to answer, he spoke loudly enough for me to hear through the closed door. "I'm not here to take anything."
His voice was calm.
"I'm here because Harold asked me to come. If you ever open the box." For a moment, I simply stood there. My hand rested on the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Every warning Harold had left me echoed inside my mind. The missing notebook, the anonymous letters, the man asking questions at the marina, and now, a stranger standing on my porch claiming Harold had sent him. Impossible. Harold had been dead for almost 10 years. The man spoke again. "You don't know me. That's understandable. But if you don't open this door, I'll leave." I promised Harold I would only try once. His voice wasn't demanding. It sounded tired, like someone carrying something heavy for a very long time. I looked through the side window. He was exactly as Frank had described. Late 60s. Gray jacket, wooden cane, weathered face. His posture wasn't threatening. If anything, he looked nervous. I unlocked the door, but left the safety chain in place. "Who are you?" The man removed his cap. "My name is Samuel Walker." The last name struck me immediately. Walker. Emily Thomas Walker. My heartbeat quickened. "You knew Thomas?" He nodded. "He was my older brother." I stared at him. Thomas had a brother. Neither Harold nor Richard had ever mentioned him. Samuel seemed to understand my confusion. "Most people don't know I exist." "Why?" "I left town before Thomas died." He looked down for a moment. "I joined the Navy. When I came home, my brother was already gone." I slowly removed the safety chain. Something about his eyes reminded me of the recording I had just heard. The same quiet sadness. The same gentleness. I opened the door. "Please, come in." Samuel stepped inside carefully, leaning slightly on his cane. He noticed the green metal box immediately. His eyes remained fixed on it. "You found it." "I did." He smiled faintly. "So, Harold finally trusted the time." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel looked around the room before answering. "He always said, The truth isn't dangerous. Only bad timing is. I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Harold. We sat at the dining room table. Neither of us touched the box. Finally, I asked, "Were you the one leaving letters inside the boat?" Samuel nodded. "Yes." "And the lantern?" "Yes." "The wet footprints?" He smiled apologetically. I should have been more careful. I couldn't help laughing softly. I thought someone was breaking in. I suppose I was. He looked genuinely embarrassed. I had a key. I remembered the brighter screw. "You opened the compartment."
No.
Samuel shook his head immediately. I checked the lock. Nothing more. "What about Harold's notebook?" His expression changed instantly. "What notebook?" "The brown leather journal." "I've never seen it." I watched him carefully. There wasn't the slightest hesitation. Either he was an extraordinary liar, or he was telling the truth. "I believe you," I said quietly. Samuel exhaled. "Thank you." He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed an old envelope. Across the front, in Harold's handwriting, were the words, "For Sam." I never opened it. He placed it beside the green box. "He told me to give it to you if you ever open the compartment." My hands trembled. Another letter. Harold had left letters everywhere. Not because he expected to die, because he expected promises to outlive him. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was only one page. "My dear Sam, if Martha is reading this beside you, then I know two things. First, I kept my promise. Second, you kept yours." I looked up. Samuel's eyes had already filled with tears. Harold continued, "You once asked why I trusted Martha without telling her the truth. Because she has something neither of us ever had.
Peace.
If I failed to protect that peace, then I failed her." Samuel quietly wiped his eyes. "I argued with him for years." "You did." "I wanted him to tell you." "He refused. Every single time." I returned to the letter. "Alone. When Martha finishes reading everything, do not guide her. Do not persuade her. Do not ask her to seek justice. Only answer the questions she chooses to ask." I smiled sadly. Even after all these years, Harold was still protecting my freedom to choose. The final lines were addressed directly to me. "Martha, if you're sitting beside Sam, please know this. He loved his brother just as deeply as I did. Don't see him as a stranger. See him as the family Thomas left behind." Silence filled the room. At last, Samuel spoke. "I've wanted to meet you for almost 30 years. I looked at him. "So, why didn't you?" He stared at Harold's letter. "Because every October, your husband reminded me that promises only matter if we keep them when they're hardest." Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then I asked the question that had been growing inside me ever since I found Emily's photograph. "Samuel." "Yes. Does Emily know any of this?" He slowly shook his head.
No.
"She believes what everyone else believes. That her father died in an unfortunate accident." He hesitated before adding one more sentence. "And she has no idea that two men quietly spent nearly 30 years making sure the truth about her father was never lost." Samuel stayed for nearly 3 hours. Not once did he rush the conversation. Not once did he try to convince me of anything. He simply answered every question I asked. Sometimes with certainty. Sometimes by admitting he didn't know. The honesty made me trust him more than any explanation could have. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since Richard mentioned the missing notebook. "Samuel." "Yes." "Who else knew about the compartment?" He leaned back in his chair. "Very few people." "How few?" "Thomas. Harold. My father. Myself. And Richard. That's all." I frowned. So, if Harold's notebook disappeared, it had to be one of those people. Samuel slowly shook his head.
No.
"What do you mean?" "There was one more." I looked at him. "My father's attorney." "The attorney?" "He prepared legal documents after Thomas died." "Did he know about the evidence?"
No.
"Only that my father kept something important hidden." I felt another piece of the puzzle move into place. What happened to him? He retired years ago. Is he still alive? I believe so. Samuel looked thoughtful, but I haven't spoken to him in at least 15 years. I wrote the name down anyway. Edward Lawson. It might matter later. Or perhaps not. After Samuel left, the house felt strangely quiet again. But it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence that follows truth. I carried the cassette player back to the dining room. There were still 4 recordings I hadn't heard. The next tape was labeled, Meeting, October. I pressed play. Static filled the room for several seconds. Then Harold spoke. If we're recording this one, it's because we're getting older. Someone laughed. Samuel. A younger Samuel. I was going to say exactly the same thing. Harold chuckled. My knees already beat you to it. For the first time since finding the box. I heard Harold laughing naturally. Not politely. Not quietly. Genuinely. It was beautiful. The recording continued. Samuel asked, "What happens when one of us dies?" Harold answered almost immediately. "The next one keeps the promise." "And if we're both gone?" There was a pause. Then Harold said something that made tears fill my eyes once again. "Then I trust Martha." Samuel laughed. "You still haven't told her anything." "I know. You really believe she'll figure it out?" "I don't." Another pause. "I believe she'll follow her heart." Samuel sighed. "That's asking a lot."
No.
Harold answered softly. "It's asking exactly enough." The tape clicked forward. Several minutes passed with ordinary conversation. Weather, fishing, repairs to the dock. Then Samuel's voice became serious. "Do you ever regret it?"
What?
Not telling her. Harold remained silent for so long that I thought the tape had stopped. Finally he answered. "Every day." I closed my eyes. I almost told her 100 times. When? The night Daniel graduated. The day we paid off the house. Our 25th anniversary. His voice cracked slightly. The day I learned I had cancer. My tears fell freely. I would stand in the kitchen, look at her, and think. Tomorrow. Samuel quietly asked, "So why didn't you?" Harold answered with one sentence. "Because every time I looked at Martha, I saw peace." I couldn't bear to replace it with my burden. The recording ended shortly afterward. I removed the cassette slowly. For years, I had wondered why Harold sometimes looked at me with sadness I couldn't explain. Now I knew. He wasn't hiding because he didn't trust me. He was hiding because he loved me. That realization changed something deep inside me. Not because secrets suddenly became acceptable. They didn't. But because I finally understood the heart behind his silence. Late that evening, Richard Collins called. "I've been thinking. So have I." I found something in my old files. My pulse quickened. What? A newspaper clipping. About Thomas?
No.
About the supervisor. I sat upright. The one who ignored the report? Yes. What about him? Richard hesitated. He testified during the investigation. I know, but that's not the interesting part. What is? He disappeared 6 months later. I frowned. Disappeared? Resigned. Sold his house. Closed his bank accounts. No forwarding address. I looked toward the engineering report lying on my table. People don't usually vanish like that.
No.
Richard agreed quietly. They usually don't. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. I finally remembered where I'd seen the man Frank described. I gripped the phone. Where? Richard answered in almost a whisper. In an old company photograph. Silence. The gray jacket. The cane. The face. It isn't the supervisor. Then who is it? Richard took a slow breath. It's his younger brother. The room suddenly felt cold. What? He worked for the company too. He wasn't involved in maintenance. He handled legal claims. My heart pounded. What are you saying? I'm saying, the man asking questions about Harold's boat may already know exactly what was hidden inside it. And for the first time since opening the compartment, I realized the truth Harold had protected for 3 decades might finally have found the people who had spent just as long trying to erase it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, because my mind refused to stop connecting pieces that had remained scattered for almost 30 years. The supervisor had disappeared. His younger brother had worked in the legal department. Someone had searched Harold's boat before I opened the compartment. The brown notebook had vanished. None of those facts proved anything, but, together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Just after sunrise, Samuel returned. He carried a small cardboard box tucked beneath one arm. "I found these in my attic," he said. "I thought you should have them." Inside were dozens of photographs. Some showed Thomas and Harold fishing. Others captured backyard barbecues, birthdays, and Christmas gatherings I had never known existed. I smiled as I looked through them. There was Harold, no older than 30, laughing so hard he had nearly fallen off a picnic bench. Thomas stood beside him, pointing toward the camera with a ridiculous grin. For years I had believed Harold had never been expressive. Now I realized life had slowly changed him. Not his nature, his circumstances. Near the bottom of the box, I found something unexpected. A folded newspaper. Its edges had become brittle with age. Across the front page, a headline read, "Shipyard Explosion Claims One Life." I carefully unfolded it. The article was short. Too short. It described the explosion as an unfortunate mechanical failure. It praised the company's commitment to safety. It mentioned Thomas by name. Then it ended. No mention of previous complaints. No mention of maintenance reports. No mention of ignored warnings. History had been rewritten before it was even written. Samuel watched quietly as I finished reading. "That's why Harold kept everything." I nodded. He knew the newspaper wasn't the truth. Samuel smiled sadly.
No.
He knew that one day, the newspaper would become history. Those words stayed with me. People trust newspapers. People trust official reports. Very few people ask who wrote them, or what was left out. Samuel reached into the box one last time. "There's something else." He handed me a faded photograph. Unlike the others, it had been taken inside an office. Several executives stood together wearing suits. Behind them hung a framed company logo. I barely glanced at the executives. My attention was drawn immediately to the man standing at the edge of the group.
Tall.
Dark hair. Sharp features. Even though he was decades younger, I recognized him instantly. The eyes. The posture. The expression. He was the man Frank had described. Only now, he had no cane. Richard had been right. This wasn't the supervisor. It was his younger brother, the company's legal advisor. I turned the photograph over. Harold had written one sentence. He knew. Nothing more. Just those two words. He knew. I suddenly understood why Harold had saved this picture. Not because it proved guilt, because it proved presence. The legal advisor had been there from the beginning. He wasn't cleaning up someone else's mistake years later. He had witnessed the story from its first chapter. Before I could say anything, my phone rang. "Richard." I answered immediately. "I've found the court files," he said. My heart raced. Were they sealed?
No.
Worse. "What do you mean?" "They're incomplete." Incomplete. Entire sections are missing. The witness statements. The maintenance exhibits. The engineering photographs. Everything Harold had protected. Richard continued. "If your documents hadn't survived, no one today would ever know they existed." I looked down at the green metal box. Suddenly, it no longer seemed like evidence for a lawsuit. It felt like a time capsule protecting history itself. Richard lowered his voice. "I also learned something else." "What?" "The legal advisor died." Relief washed over me, then disappeared just as quickly. "But," Richard continued, "he had a son." My stomach tightened. He became an attorney too. And, according to public records, he now represents the corporation that inherited the old shipyard's legal liabilities. Silence. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply changed names, changed faces, changed generations. The responsibility Harold had protected all those years had quietly survived into another era. I thanked Richard and ended the call. Samuel looked at me. More bad news. I thought carefully before answering.
No.
What then? Perspective. He frowned. I smiled faintly. For years I thought Harold was protecting old papers. I gently rested my hand on the green box. He wasn't. Samuel nodded slowly. What was he protecting? I looked at Thomas's family photograph, then at Harold's final letter. Finally, I answered. He was protecting the right of one little girl to someday know who her father really was. For the first time since this journey began, the mystery no longer mattered most. The truth did. And I knew exactly what my next step had to be. I was finally going to find Emily. The following Monday, I woke before sunrise. Not because I had somewhere to be, because for the first time in years, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I wasn't chasing a mystery anymore. I wasn't trying to prove Harold had been right. I wasn't trying to expose a company that no longer existed. I simply wanted one woman to know who her father truly was. That was all. The green metal box sat on the kitchen table. I opened it one last time before leaving. Harold's letters, Thomas's photograph, the maintenance report, the engineering inspection. Everything was exactly where I had carefully placed it the night before. I gently closed the lid. I'll bring you home, I whispered. For some reason, saying those words aloud made the responsibility feel real. At 8 o'clock, Richard Collins pulled into my driveway. He was older than I had imagined.
Thin.
Silver hair. A navy windbreaker zipped almost to his chin. When he stepped out of the car, I recognized something immediately. He moved like Harold. Not physically. Patiently. Every movement seemed deliberate. He removed his glasses and smiled. You must be Martha. And you must be Richard. He looked toward the green metal box resting beside my front door. So, he really trusted you. I smiled through tired eyes. He trusted time. Richard nodded. That sounds much more like Harold. We loaded the box carefully into the back seat. Neither of us spoke during the first 20 minutes of the drive. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt respectful. Finally, Richard broke it. I met Harold in 2002. What was your first impression? He laughed softly. I thought he was the most stubborn man I'd ever met. I believed that. I told him finding Emily would probably be impossible. What did he say? Richard smiled. Probably isn't the same as impossible. I couldn't help laughing. That sounded exactly like my husband. He hired me anyway. For 20 years? Richard nodded. Not continuously. He'd disappear for a while. Then he'd call again. Any news? Any new address? Any marriage records? Any children? Richard glanced at me. He never asked whether she was wealthy, or successful, or famous. He only ever asked one question. What? Is she all right? The tears returned before I could stop them. Even after everything, Harold's concern had never been about justice. It had always been about a little girl growing into a happy woman. After nearly 3 hours, Richard turned onto a quiet suburban street lined with maple trees. Children's bicycles rested beside driveways. Gardens overflowed with spring flowers. It looked like thousands of neighborhoods across America. Ordinary. Peaceful. He slowed the car. She's here. I looked out the window. A white 2-story house stood halfway down the block. Blue shutters. A wooden porch swing. Fresh flowers beneath every window. There was nothing remarkable about it. And somehow, that made it beautiful. Thomas's daughter had built a life. Richard parked across the street. Neither of us moved. I've imagined this moment for years, he admitted. So have I. What do you want to do? I stared at the house. What if she doesn't want to know? Richard nodded. That's possible. What if she hates us for bringing this back? Also possible. What if? He interrupted gently. Martha. I looked at him. You came here to give her a choice. Nothing more. His words settled my heart. Yes. This wasn't about forcing the past into her life. It was about returning something that had always belonged to her. Just then, the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch carrying a watering can. She looked to be in her mid-30s. Dark hair pulled loosely behind her head. Comfortable jeans. An old college sweatshirt. She moved slowly from flower pot to flower pot, humming quietly to herself. I couldn't breathe, not because I recognized her, because I recognized Thomas. The smile, the shape of her eyes, even the way she tilted her head while looking at the flowers. It was like watching her father 30 years younger. Richard whispered, "That's Emily." I covered my mouth. So much of him is still here. A little girl came running through the front door, perhaps 6 years old. She wrapped both arms around Emily's waist. Emily laughed and lifted her effortlessly into the air. The little girl squealed with delight. I watched the scene through tears. 3 generations. Thomas, Emily, her daughter. Love had survived where truth had not. Richard quietly asked, "Do you still want to do this?" I looked down at the green metal box, then back toward the porch. Emily kissed the top of her daughter's head, exactly the way Harold used to kiss Daniel when he was little. I smiled. Yes, but not today. Richard looked surprised. No. I slowly shook my head. I didn't come all this way to interrupt an ordinary Monday. I kept watching Emily laugh with her little girl. Harold waited 28 years. I think one more day won't hurt. As we quietly drove away, I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. Emily had no idea that, across the street, an old widow had just seen the ending Harold had always prayed for. She had built a beautiful life. Now, all that remained was to decide whether she was ready to know how her father had protected it before he ever had the chance to watch her grow. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was anxious, because my heart finally felt lighter. For weeks, I had been chasing a mystery. Now, I was thinking about a woman watering flowers on her front porch. A woman who laughed exactly the way her father had. Somehow, that mattered more than every document inside the green metal box. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of peace. Harold had left me the truth, but he had never told me what to do with it. That decision belonged to me. And now, it also belonged to Emily. Richard arrived just after 9 carrying a simple leather folder. "No box today?" I asked. He smiled. "I don't think we should overwhelm her." I agree. We had spent hours the previous evening deciding what to bring. Not everything. Only 3 things. Thomas's family photograph, Harold's letter to Emily, and 1 certified copy of the original maintenance report. Enough to tell the truth. Not enough to bury her beneath 30 years of grief all at once. As we drove back through the quiet neighborhood, I noticed details I had missed the day before. Children waiting for the school bus. A man washing his pickup truck. Wind chimes singing softly from someone's porch. Ordinary life. The kind of life Thomas never got to finish living. Richard parked along the curb. "Are you ready?" I took a deep breath. "No." He smiled kindly. "Good." I looked at him. "If you were ready, I'd worry you didn't understand how important this is." Together we walked toward the house. Each step felt heavier than the last. When we reached the porch, I noticed the flowers Emily had been watering yesterday. Bright yellow daisies. Exactly the kind Harold always planted near our mailbox because he said they looked happy. I rang the bell. For several seconds. Nothing. Then footsteps. The door opened slowly. Emily stood there wearing the same gentle expression I remembered from the day before. She smiled politely. "Can I help you?" For a moment, every word I had prepared disappeared. Finally, I managed. "My name is Martha. And this is Richard. We're sorry to arrive without warning." Her smile remained warm, though slightly cautious. "Is everything all right?" I looked down at the photograph in my hands, then back into her eyes. "We knew your father." Silence. Complete silence. The smile slowly faded from her face. "My father?" I nodded. "Thomas." She stared at us. For several long seconds, she didn't speak. Finally, she whispered, "I think you have the wrong house." Richard gently stepped forward. "No. We've spent many years making sure we didn't." Emily looked from him, to me, then back again. "I don't understand." "I know." I swallowed carefully. "We're not asking you to believe us. We're only asking for 15 minutes. She hesitated. Every instinct in me told her to close the door. Instead, she looked over her shoulder toward the hallway, then back at us. My daughter is at school. My husband is at work. She opened the door a little wider. You'd better come inside. Her living room felt exactly like ours once had. Family photographs. Children's drawings on the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway. A bookshelf overflowing with novels. A knitted blanket folded neatly across the sofa. A life built patiently, beautifully. She invited us to sit. No one spoke for almost a minute. Finally, she broke the silence. You said you knew my father. Yes. I don't remember him. You were very young. She nodded. I've been told that. I carefully placed the old family photograph on the coffee table. I think you've probably never seen this. Emily reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the photograph, everything changed. Her eyes widened. She stared at the smiling young man holding a little girl in yellow rain boots. Her breathing became uneven. My mother. She barely whispered the words. She kept this picture. A tear rolled down her cheek. I thought there was only one copy. She looked closely at Thomas's face, then at the little girl, then at the back of the photograph. She turned it over. Harold's handwriting. I hope she finally knows the truth. Emily frowned. Who wrote this? I answered quietly. My husband. She looked at me with confusion. I don't understand.
No.
I nodded gently. You couldn't. I reached into the leather folder and carefully removed Harold's letter. This was written for you. She didn't take it immediately. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes. Before I read anything, please answer one question. Of course. Her voice trembled. My entire life, everyone has told me my father died in an accident.
She paused.
Then asked the question Harold had carried for almost 30 years. Was that a lie? I looked at Richard, then back at Emily. Finally, with complete honesty, I answered, Your father died saving another man's life. And that man, I felt my own tears returning, spent the rest of his life making sure the world would never forget what your father really did. Emily slowly lowered her head. One tear landed on Harold's unopened letter, then another. She placed one trembling hand over the envelope, closed her eyes, and whispered the first words anyone had spoken about Thomas in nearly 3 decades that truly mattered. Tell me about my dad. Emily didn't open the letter immediately. She held it with both hands as though afraid the paper itself might disappear. For a long time, no one spoke. The room had become impossibly quiet. Finally, she looked at me. You said he spent the rest of his life remembering my father. Yes. Who was he? I smiled softly. My husband. She looked confused. The man your father saved. Emily lowered her eyes to the envelope again. My whole life. I imagined the man my father saved. She laughed nervously through her tears. I hated him. The honesty caught me by surprise. I know that sounds terrible. It doesn't. I kept thinking, if my father hadn't gone back, if he hadn't stayed, maybe he'd have come home. I slowly reached across the table. I've asked myself almost the opposite question. She looked at me. I spent years wondering why Harold survived. Neither of us spoke. Grief had brought us to the same place, just from opposite directions. Richard quietly broke the silence. Neither of you caused what happened. Emily nodded politely. I understand that.
No.
Richard answered gently. I don't think you do. He reached into the folder and removed the engineering report. He placed it beside Harold's letter. This killed your father. Emily frowned. It's just paperwork. Exactly. She looked more closely. Then her expression changed. Her eyes stopped on one sentence highlighted in red. Immediate shutdown recommended. She read it again. Then again. They knew. I nodded. They knew. Her breathing became shallow. They knew. Before my dad went to work? Yes. She covered her mouth. No. Richard quietly slid the original maintenance complaint toward her. 2 signatures rested at the bottom. Thomas Walker. Harold Dawson. Emily stared at her father's handwriting. She reached out carefully, almost afraid to touch it. My mother always kept one birthday card he wrote. She compared the signatures. The tears began immediately. It's him. She whispered the words like a child recognizing a familiar voice. It's really him. For nearly 5 minutes, she cried without trying to hide it. Not loud, not dramatically. The quiet cry of someone mourning all over again. When she finally looked up, the first thing she asked wasn't about the company, or the investigation, or the missing evidence. She asked about Harold. What kind of man spends 30 years protecting someone else's father? I smiled through my own tears. The kind who never believed he deserved to survive. Emily closed her eyes. He blamed himself. Every day. I know because he wrote about it. I handed her one page from Harold's letter. Only one. The paragraph describing Thomas's final words. She read silently. Halfway through,
She stopped.
her shoulders began shaking. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. My father told him to go home. I nodded.
To you.
I couldn't speak. To me. The room fell silent once more. Finally, Emily whispered something so softly I almost missed it. He wasn't afraid.
No.
He was thinking about another family. Yes. She looked toward a framed photograph sitting on the fireplace. A little girl. Her daughter. Slowly, she smiled through her tears. My father never got to watch me grow up. She paused. But he made sure another little boy still had his father. None of us had considered it that way before. Daniel had grown up with Harold, because Thomas had chosen to stay behind. Emily stood and walked toward the window. Outside, children were riding bicycles along the sidewalk. She watched them quietly. Then she turned back toward us. My mother hated talking about the accident. I understand now. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting me. I nodded. I believe so. Emily looked down at Harold's letter once again. I wish. She stopped. What? I wish I could thank him. My voice broke. So, do I. She smiled gently. Maybe. We still can. I frowned. What do you mean? She carefully folded Harold's letter, then looked directly at me. I'd like to meet him. I felt my throat tighten. He passed away almost 10 years ago. I know. She smiled through fresh tears. I'd still like to visit him. For a moment, I couldn't answer. Then I realized something. Harold had spent nearly 30 years visiting Thomas. Every October, perhaps, it was finally time for Thomas's daughter to visit Harold. 1 week later, Emily stood beside me in the small cemetery where Harold had been resting for almost 10 years. The morning air was cool. A gentle breeze moved through the maple trees, carrying the familiar scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. Neither of us spoke as we walked the narrow stone path. Words no longer seemed necessary. She carried only one thing, the faded family photograph, the one showing Thomas holding her when she was 4 years old. I carried Harold's old pocket knife, the same one that had hidden the tiny brass key for nearly 3 decades. Somehow, it felt right that both men were present with us that morning, even if only through the things they had left behind. When we reached Harold's grave, Emily stopped. She looked down at the simple headstone. No grand monument, just his name, his dates, and one sentence we had chosen together after his funeral. Asterisk, a faithful husband, a quiet friend, a good man, asterisk. Emily smiled through tears. They got that right. I laughed softly. They really did. She knelt carefully and placed Thomas's photograph against the headstone. Then she spoke, not loudly, almost as if she were afraid to disturb the silence. Mr. Dawson. She stopped and smiled. No, Harold. I've spent my whole life wondering who my father really was. She gently rested one hand on the photograph. Because of you, I don't have to wonder anymore. The wind stirred softly around us. She continued. My mother tried to protect me. I understand that now. You tried to protect me too. I understand that now as well. She wiped away another tear. I wish we had met, so I could have thanked you in person. She laughed quietly. I think Dad would have liked you teasing him all these years. I smiled. Oh, they teased each other constantly. She looked at me. Really? I nodded. For two men who hardly smiled in photographs. They laughed a lot. She laughed through her tears. I'm glad. So am I. For several minutes we simply stood there, listening to birds somewhere high in the trees. Then Emily reached into her purse. She removed a folded envelope. I wrote something. For Harold. Yes. She placed it gently beside the flowers. I'm not going to read it. Some letters. She smiled at me. Only belong to one person. The words immediately reminded me of Walter. Some letters belong to one person. Some promises protect people. Some protect the truth. Everything had come full circle. As we walked back toward our cars, Emily suddenly stopped. I almost forgot. She opened her purse again. Inside was a small framed photograph. It showed her little daughter standing beside Grace. The old fishing boat. They had visited the marina together 2 days earlier. Her daughter was smiling proudly while holding a tiny fishing rod Samuel had given her. Emily handed me the picture. I wanted you to have this. I looked at it for a long time. Grace no longer looked like a hiding place. She looked like what Harold had always hoped she would become. A bridge. Between two families. Between two generations. Between grief
And peace.
A month later, Emily and I returned to the marina. Samuel, Richard, Walter,
Frank.
even Daniel came. Together we watched as Grace slowly left her slip one final time. Not to disappear. Not to be sold. But to be donated to the local maritime museum. Inside the restored cabin, visitors would one day learn about an ordinary fishing boat that quietly protected the truth for nearly 30 years. Not every document. Not every letter. Those belonged to Emily now. But the story belonged to everyone. As the boat drifted slowly across the harbor, sunlight reflected off the water exactly the way Harold had always loved. I closed my eyes. For the first time since the day he died, I no longer felt like I was carrying his promise alone. It had become something much greater than either of us. A promise kept, a friendship honored, a father's name restored, and a little girl who finally grew into a woman knowing exactly who her father had been. Sometimes people believe the greatest inheritance is money, or land, or jewelry hidden beneath old floorboards. Harold left me something far more valuable. He left me the chance to give another family their history back. And in doing so, he quietly gave me mine as well. If this story touched your heart, remember this. The greatest acts of courage are not always the ones the world applauds. Sometimes they are the promises kept in silence, long after everyone else has forgotten. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And if this story reminded you that truth, kindness, and loyalty still matter, I hope you'll join me again for another journey.